Hi guys, tonight we step quietly into a winter night on the American frontier, the kind that presses in from every direction until even your thoughts feel wrapped in wool. You stand at the edge of a small camp as daylight drains away, watching breath turn white and vanish. Wood creaks, snow settles, somewhere far off something moves and then decides not to. This is not the heroic frontier you see in paintings. This is the slow version, the one that waits you out. And just so we are clear, if you dropped yourself here with modern expectations and a phone at 10%, you probably would not last a week. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell me where you are listening from and what time it is there right now. Now dim the lights and let the night arrive properly. Darkness on the frontier does not fall all at once. It leaks in. First the colours thin, browns turn grey, then sound changes, wind feels closer. You notice how your own movements seem louder than they should be. Even breathing feels like an announcement. People who lived this life learned early that night was not an interruption of the day. It was its own environment with rules that did not care about courage. You draw closer to the camp. There is no neat circle of wagons here, no glowing lanterns swinging cheerfully. Just a low fire, already reduced on purpose and shapes half hidden by snow. Quiet winter nights demanded discipline, a mainstream historical fact that shows up again and again in journals from the early 19th century is that frontier travellers deliberately kept fires small after dark. Not because fuel was scarce, but because large fires attracted attention and drained energy when they burned out. Heat was managed, not celebrated. You crouch feeling the cold seep upward through your boots. The ground is patient. It has all night. The men and women who moved across this landscape understood something modern life rarely teaches. Silence is not empty. It is full of information. You listen without trying to label anything. The faint hiss of embers, fabric shifting as someone settles deeper into a bedroll, the wind threading its way through trees like water through reeds. A quirky tidbit that often surprises people is that many frontier camps intentionally avoided talking once darkness fully set in, even among companions. Not out of fear, but because voices carried farther in cold air. Words travelled. Silence stayed put. It was a habit that crept in without anyone formally agreeing to it. You feel your shoulders drop as you stop fighting the quiet. This is where the night begins to teach you. Movement feels productive, but stillness is cheaper. Heat stays longer when you do less. People who survived multiple winters out here learned to move with purpose before dark so they could afford not to move later. It is a lesson written in frost rather than ink. Snow muffles the world. Each flake landing seems insignificant, but together they reshape sound. A twig snapping nearby feels important. Farther away it would be nothing. You learn to judge distance by instinct. Your body starts doing the math for you. This is not mystical, it is repetition. Night after night, your senses adjust. There is a long-running scholarly debate that circles these winter accounts. Some historians still argue whether frontier nights were as consistently quiet as journals suggest, or whether writers exaggerated calm in hindsight to impose order on chaotic memories. The truth likely lives somewhere in between, shaped by fatigue, fear, and the human urge to make meaning after survival. You shift your weight and feel how the cold bites harder when you rush. Slow movements preserve warmth. This is not bravery. It is accounting. Everything here is measured against how much energy it costs. Even curiosity has a price. You glance toward the fire again. It glows not flames but coals breathing softly. Someone banked it earlier with care. Not extinguished, not fed, just persuaded to last. This kind of restraint does not look impressive. It does not photograph well, but it keeps you alive through the longest hours. As full darkness settles, the sky clears. Stars appear with sharp edges, unblurred by moisture. They look closer than they should. You understand why people here oriented themselves by them without ceremony. Clocks were unreliable. Bodies were not. Cold wakes you when you need to adjust. Hunger speaks in temperature rather than pain. Fatigue arrives as heaviness, not drama. You lower yourself onto your bedroll, feeling the rough texture beneath gloves. This spot was chosen earlier, when daylight allowed comparison. Too close to trees invites falling snow. Too open invites wind. This is compromised territory. The frontier is full of those. Your breathing slows as you let the night hold you. The quiet is no longer something to fear or fill. It becomes a partner, one that asks very little if you respect it. And as you lie there listening without searching, the winter night finally closes around the camp, not as an enemy, but as a condition you have agreed to endure. The cold does not announce itself as pain at first. It arrives as instruction. You feel it in the way your fingers hesitate, before moving in the way your jaw tightens slightly without being told. Winter on the frontier rewires priorities quickly. Comfort drops down the list. Efficiency rises. The body learns faster than the mind would prefer. You lie still noticing how the cold behaves differently than you expected. It does not rush. It settles. It presses evenly, like weight rather than sharpness. People unfamiliar with sustained winter often imagine cold as an attacker. Frontier experience reframes it as an environment, something you occupy rather than fight. That shift matters more than any piece of gear. A well-established historical reality shows up repeatedly in trapper journals and military logs from the early American West. Cold-related exhaustion caused more deaths than conflict or accidents during winter travel. Not because people froze dramatically, but because they made small inefficient decisions that drained energy over days. Survival hinged on restraint. You can almost feel that lesson settling into your muscles now. You adjust one shoulder, then stop. That small movement cost heat. You do not do it again. Instead, you breathe deeper, slower, letting warmth redistribute. The cold teaches you to negotiate rather than resist. People who fought it aggressively often lost. Those who adapted quietly tended to endure. There is a strange clarity that comes with this kind of cold. Thoughts simplify. Long-term plans feel abstract and unnecessary. The night becomes a series of short agreements. Stay still, stay dry, stay fed enough, stay aware. Everything else can wait. This narrowing of focus is not panic, it is efficiency. A lesser-known detail from winter accounts is how often frontier travellers described cold as calming once routines were established. One fur trader wrote that after the first hour of discomfort, the cold felt steady and almost companionable. It stopped changing. That predictability mattered. It meant you could plan around it. You notice how sound behaves differently now. Snow absorbs high noise. Wind carries low tones farther. Your own heartbeat feels louder inside your ears. The cold sharpens internal awareness, while dulling the external world. This balance is delicate. Too much inward focus leads to missed signals. Too much outward focus wastes energy. You hover between the two. Scholars still debate whether this mental narrowing was purely physiological or partly cultural, learned through shared expectations and storytelling. Did frontier people feel calmer in cold because their bodies adapted, or because they were taught that calmness equaled competence? The answer is probably both layered together, like the bedroll beneath you. You think briefly of home, not with longing exactly, but with curiosity. Would warmth feel overwhelming now? Would silence feel empty? Frontier winters changed how people experienced comfort long after they left them. Many accounts mention men sleeping poorly indoors after months outside, unsettled by walls that blocked sound and air. The cold shifts slightly as the night deepens. Not colder, just different. You sense it through your cheeks, your toes, the way fabric stiffens. Wool behaves well here. It holds air even when compressed. That knowledge was not theoretical. It was earned often painfully by people who tried cotton once and never again. You relax your hands, letting fingers uncurl inside mitts. Tension generates heat briefly, but costs more later. The frontier teaches patience by force of consequence. You cannot rush dawn. You can only arrive intact when it shows up. As you settle deeper, the cold stops feeling like something happening to you and starts feeling like something happening around you. This distinction is subtle, but it changes everything. You are no longer bracing, you are coexisting. And with that shift, the night feels longer but also more manageable, as if the rules have finally been explained clearly enough to follow. Shelter on the frontier is not chosen for how it feels in the moment. It is chosen for how it behaves over hours. You learned that earlier, even if no one explained it outright. Now, lying here with the cold pressing evenly from all sides, you replay the decision that brought you to this exact spot. The low rise that breaks the wind just enough. The trees far enough away to avoid dumping snow all night. The ground slightly packed instead of soft. None of this looks impressive. All of it matters. You pull your coat tighter, not because you're colder, but because habit says, check the seal. Frontier shelters were rarely elaborate. A lean-to of poles and hides, a shallow dugout scooped into earth, sometimes nothing at all but a bedroll and smart positioning. A widely accepted historical reality is that most winter travelers on the American frontier slept without permanent structures far more often than modern readers assume. Cabins existed, but movement defined this life, not staying put. You remember how daylight made the site look unimpressive, almost careless. A visitor might have questioned the choice. Why not closer to the trees? Why not dig deeper? Experience answers those questions quietly now. Snow slides off slopes. Wind funnels through gaps. Cold pools in low places. Shelter is less about walls and more about avoiding mistakes. Your breath fogs the air inside your collar. You notice how moisture behaves. Too much trapped humidity becomes dangerous. People who sealed themselves too tightly often woke damp and colder than before. Ventilation was not a comfort feature. It was a survival requirement. You leave a small opening near your shoulder, just enough to let breath escape without inviting wind. A quirky detail from Frontier Winter Notes describes travelers intentionally placing shelters slightly askew rather than square to prevailing winds. The idea was not to block wind entirely, but to confuse it. Wind that could not find a clean path lost strength. This kind of thinking feels modern, but it was learned through repeated nights, like this one. You test the ground beneath you by shifting pressure slowly. Packed snow behaves better than loose. Earth holds residual warmth longer than stone. Every surface has a personality in winter. You begin to recognize them the way sailors read water. This place feels neutral. That is the highest compliment. There is ongoing debate among historians about how standardized shelter practices really were across different frontier regions. Some argue techniques were shared widely through trade networks and seasonal gatherings. Others suggest most knowledge remained hyper-local, adapted to specific landscapes, and passed orally within small groups. Lying here, it feels obvious that both are true. Broad principles travelled, details stayed home. The night deepens, you feel the shelter doing its quiet work. Wind brushes past instead of biting through. Snow accumulates without collapsing. The bedroll beneath you does not slide. These are not dramatic successes. They are the absence of failure. Frontier survival often looked like nothing happening. You think about how shelter decisions were made earlier, before darkness complicated everything. Experienced travellers never waited until night to choose where to sleep. They planned backward from cold, not forward from daylight. That habit alone separated those who lasted from those who did not. Night punishes improvisation. A strange comfort settles in as you stop evaluating and start trusting the setup. This trust is earned. It is not optimism. It is pattern recognition. The shelter has already answered several small tests. Wind shifted and did not penetrate. Snow fell and did not pile where it should not. Your body cooled and then stabilized. These signals accumulate quietly. You let your eyes close fully now, not asleep, just resting. Shelter is as much mental as physical. When you stop scanning for failure, energy returns. Frontier journals often mention how the first hour in a chosen shelter was the most anxious. After that, calm followed if nothing went wrong. That calm was not naivete, it was efficiency. You listen again. The sounds are familiar now. The fire breathes softly. Fabric rustles as someone nearby adjusts. A distant animal moves and then fades. Shelter narrows the world to a manageable size. It filters chaos. The cold presses on, but it no longer feels invasive. The shelter mediates between you and the night. Not perfectly, not generously, just enough. That has always been the frontier standard, enough to last until morning. As your breathing evens out, you realize something subtle has shifted. You are no longer thinking about the shelter as a choice you made. It feels inevitable, as if you were always meant to lie here. That illusion is one of the quiet gifts of good shelter. It convinces you that survival is natural rather than negotiated. You sink deeper into the bedroll, letting muscles unclench. The night continues outside, unconcerned. Inside your small pocket of managed space, you rest, knowing that tradition, habit, and careful attention have brought you another stretch of quiet winter hours. The bedroll waits for you with a kind of quiet authority. It is not soft in the way modern bedding pretends to be. It is dense, purposeful. When you lower yourself fully into it, you feel layers respond one by one. Fur compressing canvas, resisting trapped air, shifting to where your body needs it most. This is not luxury. It is engineering learned through repetition. You adjust only once, a small scoot of the hips to settle weight evenly. After that, you stay still. Frontier people learned early that the bedroll was not something to fidget with. Every unnecessary movement pumped warm air out and invited cold in. Once you were in, you committed. This commitment is oddly comforting. Decisions are finished. The night can proceed. Period records from the height of westward expansion consistently show that bedrolls ranked just below weapons in personal importance. Men abandoned trade goods tools, even animals, before leaving a reliable role behind. That tells you something essential. In winter, sleep equipment was not about rest, it was about surviving unconsciousness. And you pull the upper edge closer to your shoulders, careful not to seal it completely. Breath moisture needs an exit. Many early travelers learned this the hard way. Condensation freezing inside bedding led to nights that grew colder instead of warmer. The bedroll works because it balances containment and release. Like everything else out here, it is a compromise. There is an odd intimacy to this moment. The bedroll wraps around you not tightly but completely. You feel its weight along your calves, across your ribs. It smells faintly of smoke, animal, earth. These are not unpleasant smells. They signal continuity. This role has been used before. It has already proven itself. One lesser-known detail that appears in scattered winter accounts describes how experienced travelers layered bedroll contents differently, depending on humidity, not just temperature. Dry cold demanded more insulation underneath. Damp cold required better moisture barriers above. This level of attention feels obsessive until you realize mistakes cost fingers and toes. You settle your head onto whatever passes for a pillow tonight. A folded coat, a spare sack, anything that keeps your face from pressing directly against frozen ground. Neck position matters. Restricted blood flow leads to stiffness that wastes energy later. These small adjustments are not about comfort. They are about tomorrow. Researchers still disagree about how standardized bedroll construction truly was across frontier regions. Some evidence suggests common designs spread rapidly through trade and shared camps. Other findings point to highly individualized roles, tailored to personal habits and body types. Lying here wrapped in layers chosen by someone who knew their own limits, it feels personal rather than universal. The bedroll changes how sound reaches you. fabric dulls sharp noises while letting low ones pass. Wind becomes less aggressive. The world feels slightly farther away. This separation is essential. Without it, the night presses too close, keeping your nervous system alert long after it should rest. You notice how warmth builds slowly, not a rush, a gradual thickening of air around your core. Heat pools where movement has stopped. This is why stillness matters. The bedroll rewards patience. Those who tossed and turned often woke colder than when they lay down. There is a small ritual here, even if you never named it. Hands find familiar edges. Knees draw in slightly. Shoulders relax. The body remembers nights like this. Memory does not live only in the mind. It settles into joints and muscles, into the way you curl without thinking. An interesting observation tucked into a handful of diaries mentions that men often slept better in their own worn bedrolls than in newly issued or borrowed ones, even if the materials were inferior. Familiarity mattered. The body trusted what it recognized. That trust allowed deeper rest. You exhale slowly and feel the bedroll respond, fabric rising and falling with your breath. Outside, snow continues its quiet work. Inside this layered cocoon, you feel suspended between ground and sky, insulated from both without being fully separated. The bedroll does not promise comfort in the modern sense, it promises continuity. It says if you lie still and respect its limits, it will hold. That promise is enough. Out here, certainty is rare. When you find it even in something as simple as fur and canvas, you cling to it. As minutes pass, your awareness narrows. Edges soften. The bedroll fades from conscious thought and becomes background. This is success. When equipment disappears from attention, it means it is doing its job. Frontier survival depended on tools that worked quietly. You feel drowsiness approach not as collapse, but as release. Muscles let go one group at a time. The bedroll supports without demanding anything further. Tomorrow will ask enough of you. Tonight, this layered guardian stands watch, holding warmth, shaping space, and allowing you to drift without fear of what the cold might steal while you sleep. Firelight flickers low, and deliberate nothing like the cheerful blaze people imagine when they think of campfires. This one is disciplined. It glows more than it burns, a careful collection of embers, arranged to last rather than impress. You watch it without lifting your head, reading its behaviour, the way others might read a clock. Too bright means wasted fuel. Too dim means trouble later. Right now, it breathes steadily, which is exactly what you want. You remember how tempting it was earlier to build it bigger. The wood was there, dry enough. The cold invited excess. But experience overrides instinct out here. Frontier travellers learned that a roaring fire feels good briefly and punishes you afterward. When it collapses, the contrast makes the cold feel sharper than before. Managing fire is about pacing, not indulgence. Accounts from military expeditions and fur trade journeys consistently point out that winter camps rarely kept large fires burning all night. Instead, people practiced what was often described as banking the fire, a technique where embers were covered just enough to slow combustion while preserving heat. This approach conserved fuel and reduced visibility. It also demanded trust that the fire would still be there when needed. You feel that trust now. The fire is no longer something you monitor constantly. It has been set up to behave predictably. This frees your attention for other things like listening. Fire makes sound even when it is quiet. A faint crackle, a soft settling. If that sound disappears completely, you notice. If it grows too active, you notice that too. The fire speaks in small changes. There is a curious detail buried in several winter narratives, where travellers mention deliberately avoiding pine or resin-heavy wood for night fires, even though it burned hotter. The reason was smell and sound. Such wood popped loudly and carried scent farther. Subtle choices like this shaped how camps blended into darkness, rather than announcing themselves. You adjust your breathing to match the fire's rhythm. Slow, even. It sounds odd, but people often synchronized unconsciously with stable elements in their environment. The steadiness reassures the nervous system. In the absence of modern distractions, these cues mattered more. Researchers continue to examine whether frontier fire practices were primarily about safety from enemies or about efficiency and comfort. Some scholars suggest fear drove restraint. Others argue fuel management and heat regulation were the real motivators. Sitting here, it feels less like fear and more like respect. Fire is powerful, but indifferent. It will consume whatever you give it. You decide how much that is. The firelight paints moving shadows across nearby shapes. A pack, a boot, a low wall of snow pushed up earlier as a windbreak. These shadows stretch and shrink, never settling. You do not follow them. Chasing movement wastes attention. The frontier teaches you to notice without engaging. You think briefly about how fire changed social behavior. During daylight, camps buzzed with talk. At night, the fire became a quiet center rather than a gathering place. People oriented toward it without crowding it. Space mattered. Too many bodies close together stirred ash and sent sparks where they did not belong. A small but telling observation from period journals notes that experienced winter travelers could judge the remaining burn time of a fire by the smell alone. As wood shifted from one stage of combustion to another, the scent changed. This knowledge was rarely explained, it was absorbed. The fire's warmth reaches you indirectly. Not a blast, but a background presence that slows heat loss. You position yourself to receive it without relying on it. If the fire failed entirely, you would still be insulated. This redundancy is intentional. Nothing out here is trusted as a single solution. Wind moves through the area, testing the setup. It brushes past the fire and slides away, unable to gain purchase. Earlier, someone placed stones and snow, just so shaping airflow, rather than blocking it outright. Fire, like wind, behaves better when guided instead of challenged. There is an ongoing discussion among historians about how much frontier fire knowledge was inherited from indigenous practices versus developed independently by settlers and trappers. Evidence suggests significant borrowing, often unacknowledged at the time. Techniques that worked spread quickly, regardless of origin. Survival did not care about credit. You feel your eyelids grow heavier as the fire continues its quiet work. Light fades at the edges of your vision. The glow becomes less visual and more felt, warmth as an idea rather than a sensation. This is the sweet spot. Too much stimulation keeps you alert, too little leaves you uneasy. Balance arrives when nothing demands action. You remind yourself not to stare at the embers too long. Hypnotic patterns pull attention inward, which can make you lose track of external cues. Instead, you let the fire exist at the edge of awareness, a constant without commentary. As minutes stretch, the fire settles further. Embers sink. Ash forms a protective layer. This is success. The fire has transitioned from active to sustaining. It will last longer this way, breathing slowly through the night. You exhale and feel the cold and warmth negotiate around you. Neither wins completely. That is the frontier bargain. Fire does not conquer winter, it coexists with it. Tonight, that is enough. With the embers stable and the night predictable, you allow your attention to drift, confident that the glow will remain quietly present while you rest. You never fully undress, and by now that decision feels obvious rather than strange. Clothing at night on the frontier is not about comfort or etiquette, it is about readiness. You loosen layers instead of removing them, easing pressure where circulation matters, while keeping everything within reach of usefulness. Sleep is treated as a lighter state of waiting, not a full withdrawal from the world. You shift your coat open slightly, just enough to let heat redistribute without spilling out. Belts are eased, collars relaxed, boots are considered carefully. Some nights they stay on. Tonight they come off, but not far. They are placed upright close enough that your feet could find them without searching. That choice was made earlier, when you assessed moisture temperature and how stiff the leather already felt. A widely recognized historical reality shows up in military winter manuals and frontier journals alike. People slept in nearly the same clothing they traveled in, making only small adjustments for circulation and comfort. Removing layers increased the risk of losing heat while redressing in the cold, a process that cost more warmth than it saved. You feel the fabric against your skin. Wool presses with a dry insistence, slightly scratchy but dependable. It does not collapse when damp. It does not cling. It holds air and air holds heat. Cotton, behaves very differently. Many early travellers learned this lesson only once. Night was unforgiving to mistakes made during the day. There is a faint stiffness in your sleeves where sweat dried earlier. You do not worry about it now. The body adapts. Moisture that freezes near the surface can be managed. Moisture trapped deep cannot. That distinction guided every clothing choice out here. An interesting detail tucked into a few winter accounts describes how some trappers deliberately slept with one glove off, keeping a bare hand against their chest. The idea was not warmth but awareness. Skin contact made it easier to judge changes in body temperature during the night. Whether this was common practice or personal habit remains unclear, but the logic fits the environment. You tuck your chin slightly to protect your throat, then stop adjusting. Too much movement defeats the purpose. Clothing works best when left alone, once positioned correctly. The frontier teaches you when to act and when to stop. Researchers still question how much frontier sleep clothing practices varied by region versus individual preference. Some evidence suggests shared norms developed quickly in high-risk winter corridors. Other evidence points to idiosyncratic systems built around personal tolerance and experience. Lying here, it feels deeply individual. Your body knows what it needs tonight, and you listen. You become aware of pressure points slowly warming. Hips, shoulders, the small of your back. These areas need protection because they press insulation thin. Extra layers were added there deliberately earlier. That foresight pays off now when you no longer want to move. The night air brushes your face cool but not biting. You left it exposed on purpose. Breathing cold air keeps moisture out of bedding. It also keeps you lightly alert enough to notice changes without staying awake. Balance again. Always balance. A lesser-known observation from winter travel letters mentions that people often slept better when slightly cool rather than fully warm. Overheating led to sweating, which turned dangerous later. Mild discomfort now prevented serious discomfort later. This counterintuitive lesson stuck with those who survived. Your breathing slows as the clothing and bedroll reach equilibrium. Heat loss stabilizes. You are no longer warming up or cooling down. This plateau is the goal. It tells you that layers are correct. Shelter is working, and nothing demands immediate attention. You let your arms rest where they naturally fall. Hands near your chest, elbows tucked. The body curls inward, conserving surface area. No one taught you this formally. It emerges when conditions demand it. Clothing at night becomes less something you wear and more something you inhabit. It shapes how you sleep, how you wake, how quickly you could move if needed. The distinction between day and night blurs. You are dressed for whatever comes next, whether that is deeper sleep or sudden action. As your eyes stay closed longer between breaths, you feel the quiet confidence that comes from preparation done earlier. There will be no frantic scrambling in the dark, no searching for missing layers. Everything you need is already part of you. That knowledge allows rest. The frontier does not reward elegance, it rewards readiness. Tonight, wrapped in familiar fabric and deliberate choices, you drift towards sleep, knowing that if the night asks something of you, you will not have to think first. You will simply move. Your tools wait where your hands already expect them to be. This arrangement happened earlier in daylight when sight could confirm what memory would later repeat. Now in the dark, you do not need to look. You know the distance between your elbow and the knife handle. You know the angle of the rifle stock against the pack. You know which direction the hatchet's grip faces. The night rewards familiarity. It punishes searching. You test this knowledge once briefly. Fingers slide out from the bedroll and touch wood leather metal. You do not grasp anything. You simply confirm presence. Then your hand returns to warmth. That small check costs little and buys peace. Frontier nights are easier when you trust your setup. A commonly accepted detail, drawn from period letters and expedition notes, is that experienced travelers arrange tools in identical patterns every night, regardless of exhaustion. Consistency mattered more than proximity alone. In darkness, muscle memory replaced vision. This practice reduced hesitation when time felt expensive. You feel how the tools become extensions of your body, even while you rest. Their weight is not a burden now. It is reassurance. Knowing where something is allows your mind to let go of it. This is the paradox of preparedness. Attention can relax when readiness is complete. There is a small ritual embedded in this process. Knife handle angled toward the dominant hand, powder horn set away from sparks, rifle leaning with the muzzle down to avoid moisture settling inside. These choices were not improvised. They were inherited habits passed through observation rather than instruction. A curious detail appears in a handful of winter journals describing men who slept with a length of cord looped loosely around their wrist, the other end tied to a tool or pack. The purpose was not restraint, it was orientation. If woken suddenly, they could follow the cord without thinking. Whether this was widespread or rare remains uncertain, but it speaks to how seriously night readiness was taken. You consider how different this feels from modern ideas of safety. There is no lock, no alarm, no barrier, just placement and memory. The frontier relied on reducing reaction time rather than preventing all risk. You could not make the night harmless. You could only make yourself responsive. Ongoing academic discussion examines whether such meticulous tool arrangement was universal or exaggerated by later writers eager to present themselves as competent. Some researchers argue that chaos was more common than accounts admit. Others counter that survivors were precisely those who cultivated order. Lying here, you suspect selection bias tells part of the story. Those who lived to write remembered patterns that worked. You listen again. Nothing presses for action. The tools remain untouched. This is success. They exist for contingencies, not expectations. You are not anticipating conflict. You are eliminating surprise. Surprise wastes time. Time drains heat. Your breathing stays slow. The presence of tools nearby does not excite you. It calms you. Readiness is not adrenaline. It is quiet confidence built from repetition. The night feels less threatening when you know exactly what you could do if it changed. You recall how earlier before darkness you rehearsed movements without moving. Rolling to one side, knees drawing in, hand reaching, standing only after everything else is ready. This mental practice costs nothing and pays later. The body responds faster when it has already imagined the sequence. A lesser-known observation from winter travel memoirs mentions that men often place tools, handle first toward expected movement paths, even while half asleep. Orientation mattered. Reaching across the body wasted effort. Small efficiencies accumulated. You shift your wrist slightly and feel the knife handle brush fabric. The sensation is familiar grounding. You do not grip it. You do not need to. Its presence is enough. Tools like shelter and clothing work best when they fade into the background. The fire crackles softly. Wind moves and moves on. Snow continues its patient work. The tools remain still. They are not part of the night's soundscape. That silence is intentional. Loose metal clinks. Unsecured items roll. Experienced travelers avoided such noise. Everything had a place and it stayed there. There is debate among historians about whether frontier life was as systematically organized as some accounts suggest, or whether chaos dominated more often than memory admits. It is likely both existed depending on experience and circumstance. What matters is that order increased survival odds. People learned that quickly. You feel your muscles relax further as the need to plan recedes. Planning happened earlier. Now is the time to rest within those decisions. The frontier night does not reward constant vigilance. It rewards selective awareness. You listen, but you do not scan. You remain available without being tense. Tools nearby do not mean you expect trouble. They mean you respect possibility. Out here, possibility is always present, even when nothing happens. The night feels wide, but your immediate world is small and controlled. Your eyes remain closed as minutes stretch. The bedroll holds, clothing insulates, fire sustains, tools wait. This layering of systems creates stability. No single element is trusted completely. Together, they form something reliable. As drowsiness deepens, the tools blur into memory rather than objects. You could draw them if needed. You hope you will not. That hope is not naive. It is practical. Most nights passed quietly. Preparation existed for the rare ones that did not. The frontier taught people to arrange their lives around low probability, high consequence events, without letting those events dominate daily experience. Tools nearby allow you to sleep without imagining worst-case scenarios. They close the loop between readiness and rest. You exhale slowly and let your hands settle where they naturally fall. Fingers loosen. The night continues without interruption. Somewhere beyond your small circle of order, the winter world remains indifferent. Here within reach of what matters, you drift towards sleep, knowing that if the quiet breaks, you will not be starting from nothing. You trust animals more than silence out here, and that trust has been earned slowly, night by night. Silence can lie. It can flatten danger until it feels distant, harmless. Animals rarely do that. They react first without interpretation, without pride. As you lie still wrapped in layers and habits, your attention drifts toward the shapes nearby that breathe differently than you do. The horse stands not far from camp weight shifted onto one hind leg, head low. Its breathing is steady deep, almost bored. That tells you more than any scan of the dark could. Calm animals mean conditions are stable. A sudden stamp, a snort, a head lifting sharply would change everything. Until then, you let the animal do the watching for you. Written records from frontier travel make frequent mention of this quiet partnership. Horses and dogs were not treated as companions in the modern emotional sense. They were extensions of awareness. A well-documented reality from winter expeditions is that travelers judged night safety less by what they personally heard, and more by how their animals behaved. Restless animals were taken seriously, even when no obvious threat could be identified. You listen for the dog as well. It sleeps lightly curled near the edge of camp where sound reaches first. Its ears flick even while its body remains still. This half-sleep is not anxiety. It is default mode. The animal was shaped for this role long before you relied on it. There is an intriguing observation found in a handful of winter journals where travellers mention loosening reins or tethers at night rather than tightening them. The logic was counterintuitive. A horse tied too tightly could not express early warning movements. Given some slack, it could shift turn, signal discomfort without panicking. That nuance reveals how closely people watched animal behaviour. You feel reassured without feeling guarded. That distinction matters. The animals carry part of the cognitive load. Your nervous system is allowed to rest because theirs remains alert. This division of labour was not romanticised, it was practical. Night was long. Human vigilance was expensive. Researchers continue to explore whether frontier reliance on animals at night was learned primarily through experience or inherited knowledge. Some argue these practices came directly from indigenous traditions absorbed through observation rather than formal teaching. Others suggest similar conclusions would have been reached independently by anyone spending enough nights exposed. Either way, the result was the same. Animals became trusted sensors. You adjust your breathing to avoid startling them. Sudden movement can ripple outward. Animals notice changes before you do, but they also react to you. Mutual awareness forms quietly. You are part of their environment as much as they are part of yours. The horse exhales a long breath that steams briefly in the cold. No tension there. You let your own muscles soften a fraction more. This is the feedback loop. Calm produces calm. A small but telling detail appears in some accounts describing dogs positioned deliberately downwind of camp. The reason was scent. Dogs detected changes in smell long before sound or sight signaled anything. Wind direction mattered. Placement mattered. Nothing was random. You think briefly about how modern life separates humans from animal cues. Indoors, insulated, automated, we outsource awareness to devices. Out here, awareness is shared across species. It feels ancient and immediate. There is no interface, just presence. Scholarly discussion still circles the question of how accurate these animal behavior interpretations really were. Did travelers misattribute meaning to random movements? Or did consistent exposure genuinely tune perception? Evidence suggests experienced individuals were remarkably accurate, while novices often misread signals. Familiarity sharpened interpretation. The dog shifts slightly, resettling without lifting its head. That movement tells you more than if it had stood. It means adjustment, not alarm. You register it and move on. The skill lies not in noticing everything, but in knowing what can be ignored. Snow continues to fall lightly. Animals respond to snowfall differently than humans. They accept it. No irritation, no commentary. Their indifference is contagious. You stop evaluating the snow as good or bad. It simply is. A lesser-known anecdote from a fur trader's winter journal describes a night when a dog refused to sleep near camp pacing, instead along a tree line. The men ignored it at first, assuming hunger or restlessness. Later, they discovered a shifting ice shelf upstream that would have flooded their camp had they stayed. Whether coincidence or instinct, the story reinforced trust in animal unease. You do not romanticize this partnership. Animals fail sometimes. They get tired, they misjudge, but so do humans. Shared vigilance reduces blind spots. That reduction matters more than perfection. The night deepens, temperature steadies, the animals remain calm. You allow yourself to drift closer to sleep, knowing that if something changes, you will not be the first to know. That knowledge lowers the background hum of alertness that keeps many people awake. You notice how sound carries differently now. Hoof movement would be unmistakable. So would a dog's low growl. Silence combined with animal calm becomes meaningful. It tells you that nothing new has entered the immediate world. There is ongoing academic conversation about whether this reliance on animals shaped frontier psychology over time, making people more attuned to nonverbal cues even in human interaction. Some evidence suggests prolonged exposure increased sensitivity to subtle signals broadly. Out here, you feel that sensitivity sharpening. Your eyes remain closed. The animals do not require visual confirmation. Their sounds and movements are enough. You trust patterns more than snapshots. The horse shifts weight again, then stills. Snow slides softly off its back. It does not shake, no urgency. You breathe out, slowly matching the pace of the night. As minutes stretch, animals fade into background awareness rather than active monitoring. This is the goal. When systems work, they disappear. You do not think constantly about shelter once it holds. You do not think constantly about fire once it settles. Animals are no different. The frontier night is not guarded by walls or weapons alone. It is watched by ears that turn before eyes, by noses that read air, by instincts unburdened by narrative. You benefit from that without ceremony. Your body relaxes further. Sleep approaches in shallow waves, interrupted only by occasional awareness, checks that cost little. The animals remain steady. Their calm anchors yours. As you drift, you realize that trust does not mean blindness. It means informed release. You have stacked the night in your favor through choices made earlier. Now you let those choices carry you. Somewhere beyond camp, the winter world continues unchanged. Within this small pocket of shared awareness, you rest knowing that long before danger reaches you, something with four legs and sharper senses would have already noticed, already shifted, already told the night that it was no longer welcome. Snow changes character once it stops being a novelty. Earlier, when the first flakes fell, you noticed each one. Now they arrive without comment, layering quietly onto everything that does not resist them. The world grows softer without becoming warmer, and yet something shifts in your favour. Snow begins to work for you. You feel it first in sound. The wind loses its edge. What was once a sharp, searching presence becomes muffled, as if padded. Snow absorbs noise, breaks up. Airflow fills gaps that cold air would otherwise exploit. You breathe, and notice that the night feels thicker, less hollow. This is not imagination. Accumulated snow traps air, and trapped air slows heat loss. Field notes from winter expeditions across the Rockies and northern plains frequently observed that camps felt more stable after heavy snowfall provided shelters were not crushed. Travellers reported waking warmer after snowstorms than before them, a counterintuitive outcome that puzzled readers unfamiliar with winter physics. Snow, when undisturbed, behaves like insulation rather than exposure. You lie still and let the snow continue its quiet labour. It seals cracks along the edges of your shelter. It piles gently against windward sides, redirecting airflow. Earlier, you would have brushed it away instinctively. Now you leave it alone. Interfering wastes effort and removes benefit. There is a subtle smell that comes with fresh snow, clean and faintly mineral. It mixes with smoke residue and animal scent, creating an atmosphere that feels contained. The night no longer stretches infinitely outward. It feels closer, but in a protective way, like walls drawn in around you. A small but intriguing detail mentioned in several winter travel diaries describes people deliberately allowing snow to accumulate over parts of their shelters rather than clearing it constantly. They learned through experience that light layers improved insulation, while frequent clearing exposed seams and increased drafts. Knowing when to stop working mattered as much as knowing when to start. You shift your awareness inward, noticing how your body responds. Heat loss slows, breathing steadies further. The bedroll feels more effective now than it did an hour ago. Nothing about your setup changed, except what the environment added. There has long been discussion among historians about whether frontier travellers truly understood the insulating properties of snow, or whether they simply observed effects without grasping cause. Some argue knowledge was practical rather than theoretical. Others point to indigenous winter practices as evidence of a deeper understanding passed on indirectly. Whatever the source, the result was clear. Snow was treated with respect rather than fear once its behaviour was known. You remember earlier worries about snow load, about collapse, about being buried. Those concerns do not disappear, but they recede into proportion. Light snow is manageable. Heavy accumulation demands attention. Tonight the snowfall is cooperative. You can tell by the way it lands, by the lack of strain on shelter supports. Snow also changes how light behaves. Fire, glow, diffuses outward instead of cutting sharply into darkness. Shadows soften. The world feels less stark. This visual quiet contributes to mental quiet. There are fewer hard edges for the mind to catch on. A lesser-known observation from Mountain Winter accounts notes that people often slept more deeply during steady snowfall than on clear, bitter nights. Clear skies allowed heat to radiate away rapidly. Snow clouds acted like a lid, reflecting warmth back toward the ground. This atmospheric effect was not described scientifically at the time, but it was felt. You exhale and let the snow continue without interference. Intervention is tempting. Doing something feels safer. But stillness here is strategic. The frontier teaches restraint not as passivity, but as calculated patience. The horse stands with snow collecting along its back. It does not shake. That tells you everything. Animals tolerate snow well when conditions are stable. Shaking would mean irritation or in balance, its stillness mirrors yours. There is ongoing scholarly conversation about how winter narratives framed snow emotionally. Some writers described it as oppressive, others as comforting. Modern analysis suggests perspective shifted with experience. Early encounters framed snow as threat, later ones framed it as tool. You feel that shift now firsthand. Snow also erases, tracks soften, sharp lines blur, evidence of movement fades. This can be dangerous or advantageous depending on circumstance. Tonight, it simply adds to the sense of isolation. The world feels less busy, less populated by possibilities. You listen again. Sounds are muted. Even the fire seems quieter, as if snow has dampened its voice. This reduction in sensory input allows your nervous system to downshift further. Sleep approaches not as collapse, but as glide. There is a curious comfort in knowing that snow is indifferent. It does not judge your preparation. It responds to physics, not intention. If you work with it, it rewards you. If you fight it, it drains you. That clarity simplifies decisions. A small anecdote from a winter trapping account describes a man waking during snowfall and briefly panicking because everything felt too quiet. He later realized the snow had simply wrapped the world in silence. That realization stayed with him, reshaping how he interpreted quiet thereafter. You feel your thoughts slow. The snow outside continues its steady accumulation, each flake insignificant alone, powerful together. It mirrors how survival works here. No single decision saves you. Accumulation does. Your body sinks deeper into the bedroll. Muscles loosen. Breathing lengthens. The cold remains present, but moderated, negotiated by layers of fabric habit, and now snow. You do not drift immediately into sleep. Instead, you hover in that in-between space where awareness softens, but does not disappear. This state feels safe. The environment is stable. Systems are working. Nothing calls for change. The frontier night, wrapped in snow, holds steady. It does not demand heroics. It asks only that you stay where you are and let insulation, patience, and quiet cooperation do their work. As minutes stretch toward hours, snow continues to fall, reshaping the world gently, persistently. Within your small managed pocket of warmth, you rest, knowing that what once felt like an enemy has become another layer of protection, another ally in the long arithmetic of winter nights. Sleep does not arrive as a single event. It comes in pieces, drifting in and out, never fully claiming you for long. At first, this feels like failure. You expect rest to be solid, uninterrupted, the way it is described in warm rooms and quiet houses. Out here, that expectation dissolves quickly. Broken sleep is not a flaw. It is a design shaped by cold awareness and necessity. You surface briefly, not because of noise or discomfort, but because the body checks in with itself. Breath steady, fingers responsive, feet still warm enough. Nothing requires action. You let yourself sink again. These small awakenings are gentle, almost polite. They do not startle, they reassure. Frontier diaries from winter journeys frequently note this pattern without complaint. Travelers wrote about waking many times through the night, listening, adjusting, then sleeping again. They did not frame it as insomnia, they framed it as normal. Continuous sleep belonged to houses with walls and stoves, not to open ground and moving air. You notice how time behaves strangely here. Minutes stretch, then compress. Without a clock, your sense of duration becomes internal. Sleep is measured in depth rather than length. A few minutes of deep rest can feel more restorative than hours of shallow dozing. The body adapts to this rhythm faster than the mind expects. A curious aside found in some winter correspondence describes people losing the ability to estimate time accurately after weeks outdoors. Night felt endless, yet mornings arrived sooner than expected. This distortion was not distressing. It simply became another condition to navigate. You wake again this time because your position has shifted slightly. One knee presses too hard against the ground. You adjust slowly, deliberately, making the smallest movement necessary. Heat is conserved. The bedroll resettles. You exhale and drift back down. There is ongoing discussion among historians about whether fragmented sleep was universal on the frontier or primarily a winter phenomenon. Some suggest warmer seasons allowed longer stretches of rest. Others argue that vigilance and environmental exposure kept sleep light year-round. What seems clear is that winter amplified the pattern rather than creating it. You begin to appreciate these brief awakenings. They create a sense of continuity. You are never fully gone. The night does not feel like a black void you fall into. It feels like a river you step in and out of, always aware of its temperature, its current. Each time you surface, the environment feels familiar rather than alarming. Snow continues. Fire remains steady. Animals are calm. Tools stay where they should. This familiarity allows you to return to rest without adrenaline. The nervous system learns that waking does not equal danger. A lesser-known detail from winter travel notes mentions that some people intentionally timed their awakenings around bodily cues rather than fear. Slight chill prompted a tuck of fabric. Dry mouth led to a sip of water. Discomfort was addressed early before it escalated. This proactive approach prevented full wakefulness. You feel the edges of dreams forming now thin and incomplete. They do not unfold into stories. They arrive as impressions, movement, temperature, direction. Your mind mirrors the environment, stripping away excess detail to conserve energy. Dreams become lighter, easier to release. Sleep and wake blur together. You no longer track which is which. Awareness rises and falls like breath. This state feels sustainable. You are not forcing rest, you are allowing it. Scholars continue to examine whether this pattern of sleep influenced frontier psychology long-term. Some evidence suggests people accustomed to segmented rest developed greater tolerance for interruption and uncertainty. Others argue the effects were temporary, fading once people returned to settled life. Lying here, it feels like a skill rather than a burden. You wake once more, noticing a subtle change in sound. Snowfall has slowed. The quiet feels different. You listen briefly, then relax. Nothing else has changed. The night remains stable. This rhythm repeats itself without effort. Wake, check, adjust, sleep. There is no frustration, no judgment. The body understands the assignment, even if the mind once resisted it. Eventually you realize that you are no longer aware of each transition. Sleep deepens in patches. Awareness thins. The boundaries soften. This is rest frontier style. Not the kind that erases the world, but the kind that coexists with it. You do not count hours. You do not aim for morning. You simply move with the night as it unfolds. Each fragment of sleep adds to the next. Accumulation matters more than continuity. As the night stretches on, you find that these broken pieces knit together into something whole. Not perfect, not luxurious, but sufficient. Out here, sufficiency is the highest standard. You sink into another shallow dream, knowing that if you wake again, it will be gentle. The night has proven itself predictable. That predictability allows deeper rest than you expected. Sleep continues to come and go, quietly, reliably, until at some point you are no longer marking its arrival or departure. You are simply within it, carried forward by a rhythm shaped by cold patience and long familiarity with the way winter nights actually work. You learn to listen without moving. This skill arrives quietly built from many nights where sitting up felt expensive and unnecessary. Your body stays heavy and warm, while awareness stretches outward, thin and alert. The dark teaches you that movement is not required for attention. In fact, movement often interferes with it. Sound behaves differently, at night, especially in winter. It travels farther, but it also loses detail. Snow absorbs some frequencies and sharpens others. A branch snapping carries meaning. A slow creak means something else. Wind moving through different textures tells its own story. You do not name these sounds, Naming them would wake you fully. You simply register them and let them pass through you. Accounts from frontier winters frequently mention experienced travelers, identifying animals' weather shifts, and even human movement while barely opening their eyes. This was not framed as a special talent. It was described as habit developed over long exposure. Listening became layered. You heard what mattered and filtered out the rest. You lie still now practicing that same discipline. A faint scrape reaches you. Not close, not urgent. Your breathing remains steady. You note the direction, the quality, then let it go. The sound dissolves into the larger fabric of night. There is a subtle distinction between listening and waiting. Waiting implies expectation. Listening simply receives. The frontier favors the second. Expectation burns energy. Reception costs very little. You allow sound to come to you rather than reaching for it. A small but revealing detail appears in some winter journals where people mention recognizing familiar sounds so completely that silence itself became informative. When the usual night noises stopped, that absence spoke louder than any sudden crash. Silence, when contextualized, could signal change. You feel your ears sharpen even as your body relaxes. This seems contradictory, but it works. Tension dulls perception. Calm sharpens it. Your nervous system finds a low gear where awareness remains high without agitation. Researchers still discuss whether this heightened auditory sensitivity was purely adaptive or partly psychological. Some suggest prolonged quiet trained the brain to amplify subtle input. Others argue people simply learned which sounds to prioritize. Lying here, it feels like both. The environment shapes perception, and perception reshapes attention. You notice how your breathing blends into the night. You keep it slow, quiet, controlled. Loud breathing can mask external sounds. This awareness becomes automatic. You're not holding your breath. You're matching the night's volume. Snow shifts somewhere nearby, sliding off a branch. The sound is soft spreading rather than sharp. You recognize it instantly and dismiss it. That dismissal is important. Constant evaluation would keep you awake. Confidence allows you to return to rest. There is an old observation buried in winter travel letters that describes people waking in the morning with sore jaws, not from cold, but from clenching teeth while listening too hard all night. Over time, experienced travelers learn to relax facial muscles while keeping ears attentive. Efficiency again. You adjust your head a fraction, not to hear better, but to release tension in your neck. Then you stop. One movement is enough. The rest can wait. Listening becomes a background process. You do not strain for it. It hums quietly beneath drifting thoughts. This allows sleep to approach without shutting down awareness completely. You hover in that middle space where the night can still reach you if it needs to. A lesser-known anecdote from a trapper's memoir describes how he could tell when someone new joined a camp at night, simply by how the soundscape changed. Not louder, just different. Rhythm shifted, familiar noises adjusted. This sensitivity came from nights spent doing exactly what you're doing now. You feel a faint sense of control return not over the environment, but over your response to it. Listening without moving keeps options open. You can act if needed, but you are not burning energy in anticipation. The fire makes a small sound, a settling of embers. You note it and move on. The animals remain calm. Wind stays consistent. These confirmations stack quietly, reinforcing the sense that nothing requires attention. There is ongoing scholarly interest in how this style of listening influenced frontier communication more broadly. Some suggest people became better at reading tone and pause in conversation because they were so attuned to sound cues. Others argue this sensitivity faded once people returned to settled life. Out here, it feels deeply ingrained. Your thoughts slow further. Listening no longer feels like an activity. It feels like a state. The night is not something you monitor. It is something you inhabit. You drift closer to sleep, but you do not disappear into it. Awareness remains porous. A sound could pass through and bring you back without shock. This gentleness matters. Sudden waking costs energy. Gradual surfacing preserves it. The frontier night rewards this approach. Those who bolted upright at every noise exhausted themselves. Those who listened without moving lasted longer. This lesson is not dramatic. It is learned quietly, night after night. You realize that your body has stopped keeping track of time altogether. Listening replaces counting. The night becomes a continuous texture rather than a sequence of moments. Snowfall has nearly stopped now. The quiet is deep but not empty. It is full of small predictable sounds that mean stability. You let that stability carry you. Your eyes remain closed. Your ears remain open. Your body rests in the balance between the two. Sleep drifts in again, light but steady. Listening without moving allows you to rest without surrender. It lets the night exist without demanding response. In this posture, wrapped in layers of habit and sound, you find a kind of peace that only comes when awareness and rest stop competing and start cooperating. Warmth changes the rules people pretend to live by. Out here, the idea of sleeping alone feels less noble and more inefficient once temperatures drop far enough. You remember the first time this lesson became clear, not as a dramatic moment, but as a quiet calculation. Two bodies lose heat more slowly than one. Pride does not enter the equation. The cold does not negotiate with it. Tonight, you are alone, but the memory of shared warmth lingers. You feel it in the way you position yourself, curling inward, as if another back might press against yours. The body remembers solutions, even when circumstances change. This is not sentiment. It is arithmetic learned through exposure. Well-established accounts from frontier winters describe shared sleeping arrangements with remarkable casualness. Men slept shoulder to shoulder, feet overlapping backs pressed together beneath shared coverings. These arrangements were not framed as intimacy or friendship. They were framed as efficiency. Heat pooled where bodies met. Gaps disappeared. Wind lost its entry points. That was the entire logic. You imagine how it felt the first time boundaries softened under necessity. Awkwardness burned off quickly in the face of cold. Out here, bodies were resources, not symbols. The math was simple and unforgiving. More surface area exposed meant more heat lost. Shared space reduced that loss. There is a lesser-known detail scattered through winter journals describing how people instinctively synchronized breathing when sleeping close together. Not consciously, it just happened. Rhythms aligned. The shared air warmed more evenly. Whether this had measurable thermal benefit or simply psychological comfort remains unclear, but those who wrote about it noticed the effect. You shift slightly, now alone, but still conserving space. The bedroll feels larger than necessary, but you do not sprawl. Old habits linger. The body continues to behave as if efficiency matters even when conditions ease slightly. Researchers continue to explore how common shared sleeping truly was across different frontier contexts. Some argue it was widespread during peak winter travel and less so during milder conditions. Others suggest later moral sensibilities led writers to understate how routine these arrangements were. The evidence points to pragmatism overriding social discomfort whenever survival was at stake. You breathe out slowly, imagining shared warmth not as a memory of people but of function. The human body radiates heat whether pride approves or not. Skin does not care about cultural scripts. It cares about physics. Frontier life stripped away pretense quickly. There is an odd comfort in this clarity. Modern life often complicates decisions with layers of meaning. Out here, choices simplify. What works stays. What does not fades fast. Shared warmth worked, so it stayed. You notice how your own body presses heat inward, now minimizing exposed surface. Knees drawn up, arms tucked, chin lowered. This posture mimics the geometry of shared sleeping even when you are alone. The lesson has been internalized. A curious anecdote from a winter trading post letter mentions visitors being surprised at how casually people rearranged sleeping positions during the night to maintain warmth, rolling closer as temperatures dipped and drifting apart slightly as conditions eased. No words were exchanged, bodies communicated directly. You consider how trust played a role here. Sharing warmth required a baseline of cooperation. Out here, that trust was often situational rather than personal. You trusted someone because the cold made betrayal inefficient. This kind of trust was not sentimental, it was structural. Scholarly discussion still circles the psychological impact of these arrangements. Some argue they reduced loneliness and reinforced group cohesion. Others suggest emotional detachment was more common with physical closeness, stripped of deeper meaning. Both interpretations likely hold truth depending on context and individuals involved. You lie quietly, feeling the cold moderated by layers and memory. Even alone, the knowledge that shared warmth was once an option softens the night. It reminds you that survival here was rarely solitary even when you slept apart. The wind shifts slightly, testing the shelter. Snow holds, fire remains steady. You feel the night deepen but not worsen. The cold does not intensify, it stabilizes. This is the window where shared warmth would have mattered most. You are prepared regardless. There is something grounding about remembering that frontier survival was rarely heroic in isolation. It was communal, negotiated, practical. People endured together because bodies like tools worked better in combination. You exhale and let that understanding settle. Even alone, you're not disconnected from those lessons. They live in posture, in restraint, in the quiet acceptance that efficiency often looks like closeness. Sleep approaches again, not heavy, not complete, but sufficient. The memory of shared warmth fades into background awareness, leaving behind a simple truth. Out here, survival was less about standing alone and more about fitting together when the cold demanded it. Your breathing slows, muscles loosen. The night continues without interruption. Wrapped in fabric habit and inherited arithmetic, you rest knowing that even solitude carries the imprint of cooperation learned under winter skies. Hunger does not always arrive as an empty feeling. On nights like this, it arrives as cold, a hollow awareness that sits deeper than the stomach, closer to the bones. You recognize it, not as discomfort, but as information. The body is checking its reserves. It wants to know what it has left to burn. Earlier, before darkness fully claimed the camp, you ate with intention. Not quickly, not carelessly. Food choices on the frontier were made with night in mind. Fat mattered. Density mattered. Meals were not judged by taste, but by duration. What would last longest when movement stopped? Surviving accounts from winter travel across the American interior repeatedly emphasized the importance of evening meals. Travelers who went to bed hungry often woke shivering, even when well clothed and sheltered. The body needs fuel to generate heat. Without it, insulation only delays the inevitable. This understanding was not theoretical. It was learned through nights that ended badly. You feel the quiet weight of that earlier food now. Not heavy, not uncomfortable, just present. It sits low and steady, releasing energy slowly. This was the goal. Fast hunger spikes were useless here. Slow burn mattered. There is a small but fascinating detail scattered through winter journals describing how some frontier travelers deliberately saved a final bite of food to eat just before sleep, even if they were not hungry. The idea was to trigger digestion as the body settled, increasing internal heat production during the coldest hours. Whether universally practiced or personally discovered, the logic was sound. You shift slightly, noticing that your hands feel warmer than they did earlier. This is not just insulation, it is metabolism, the body working quietly on your behalf. Hunger, when ignored, becomes cold. Food turns that cold into warmth from the inside out. You remember times when this lesson was learned the hard way. Nights when you went to bed light, telling yourself you would eat in the morning. Morning felt very far away then. Frontier life corrected that thinking quickly. Tomorrow only mattered if you made it through tonight. There is ongoing discussion among historians about how reliable frontier food supplies really were during winter travel. Some argue scarcity was exaggerated by later storytellers. Others point to extensive evidence of rationing, hunger, and improvisation. The truth likely varied by route season and preparation. What remains consistent is that experienced travellers treated food as thermal equipment, not just sustenance. You feel no urgency now. Hunger is quiet. That silence is reassuring. It means you planned correctly earlier. The body is not asking for anything urgent. That frees attention for rest. A curious observation from a trader's winter letter mentions that people often dreamed more vividly after heavy evening meals, though the dreams were rarely remembered clearly. Some speculated digestion influenced mental activity during sleep. Others dismissed it as coincidence. Either way, the connection between food and night experience was noted. You let your breathing deepen, feeling warmth radiate outward from your core. This heat supports everything else. Clothing traps it, bedroll holds it, shelter protects it, fire supplements it, but food creates it. Without that internal source, all other measures struggle. You consider how modern advice often separates eating from sleep. Out here, they are inseparable. The night is long. The body does not stop working when eyes close. It needs material. There is scholarly debate about whether frontier diets were intentionally optimized for winter survival or simply the result of limited options. Some evidence suggests deliberate planning, especially among experienced trappers and guides. Other evidence points to opportunism and adaptation rather than design. Lying here feeling the steady warmth from within it feels intentional enough. You do not think about tomorrow's meals. Planning too far ahead wastes energy. Tonight's food did its job. That is enough. The cold remains present but moderated. You notice how hunger and cold intertwine. When one is addressed, the other softens. This connection becomes intuitive over time. You learn to read temperature changes as signals about fuel, not just environment. A lesser-known anecdote from a winter expedition diary describes a man waking repeatedly at night to chew small pieces of frozen fat, letting them melt slowly in his mouth before swallowing. The practice was not pleasant, but it kept him from shivering through the coldest hours. Such improvisation reveals how deeply people understood the food-heat connection. You are spared that tonight. Preparation did the work earlier. This allows you to rest without interruption. As minutes pass, you drift towards shallow sleep again. Dreams, if they come, will be thin, shaped more by sensation than story. Hunger will not pull you back to wakefulness. Cold will not sharpen suddenly. The balance holds. You exhale slowly, feeling gratitude, not as emotion, but as physical relief. The body is content. That contentment is quiet but powerful. Out here, hunger is not a moral failing or an inconvenience. It is a condition to manage like wind or snow. Those who respected it lasted longer. Those who ignored it paid later. You sink deeper into rest, confident that the internal fire has been fed. The night stretches on, but it no longer feels like something to endure. It feels manageable. Wrapped in layers of fabric and foresight, you allow sleep to carry you forward, knowing that the simple act of eating earlier has done more to protect you than any single piece of gear ever could. Your feet make their presence known long before the rest of your body complains. They always do, closest to the ground, easiest to sweat, slowest to dry. They are the first place small problems grow into serious ones. You learn to listen to them early, even before you understood why the lesson mattered so much. Earlier, before settling in, you made decisions that now quietly pay off. Socks changed, insoles adjusted, boots loosened and set where they could breathe without freezing solid. You remember the texture of the wool as you pulled it smooth with careful to remove every wrinkle. A fold at night becomes pain by morning. Pain becomes hesitation. Hesitation ends journeys. Records from winter travel during the fur trade era consistently show that foot injuries sidelined more men than storms or encounters ever did. frostbite, trench foot, infected blisters. None arrived dramatically. They developed from neglect, dampness, or impatience. Veterans wrote about feet the way sailors wrote about hulls. If they failed, everything else followed. You flex your toes inside dry socks and feel sensation answer back. Not sharp, not numb, just present. That response tells you enough. Feet that speak clearly are healthy feet. Silence would worry you more. There is a lesser-known detail buried in some expedition notes, describing how experienced travellers sometimes slept with their socks tucked inside their clothing, rather than on their feet, using body heat to dry them slowly overnight. This was done carefully, rotated between nights, never rushed. The goal was not dryness at all costs, but avoiding moisture freezing in place. You chose a different option tonight. Socks on, boots off but nearby. Conditions allowed it. This flexibility comes with experience. Rules exist, but they bend depending on circumstance. Rigid habits break faster than adaptable ones. You remember how earlier in the day your feet felt fine even when damp. Movement hides weakness. Blood flow masks problems. Night removes those illusions. When you stop, everything surfaces. That is why attention here matters so much. There is ongoing discussion among historians about whether frontier foot care practices were formally taught or learned entirely through failure and observation. Some evidence points to shared advice passed along trails and trading posts. Other evidence suggests most lessons were personal and painful. Either way, those who learned them rarely forgot. You shift slightly, careful not to disturb insulation around your legs. The movement is slow and controlled. You do not want cold air rushing in. Feet are protected now. Let them rest. A small but telling anecdote from a winter trapping journal mentions a man who carried an extra pair of socks, long after discarding other spare clothing. When asked why, he reportedly said, "Everything else can be endured, but losing your feet ends things quickly." That logic spread fast. You notice how the bedroll compresses under your heels. Extra padding was placed there deliberately. Pressure points lose heat faster. This foresight matters now when you're too settled to fix mistakes. Your feet grow warmer as circulation stabilizes. This warmth does not surge. It builds gradually, then holds. That plateau is what you want. Overheating leads to sweat. Sweat leads to danger. Balance again. You think briefly about how modern footwear isolates people from sensation, making it easier to ignore early warning signs. Out here, you rely on feedback, tingling, pressure, temperature. You listen and respond before problems announce themselves loudly. There remains scholarly disagreement about how often frontier travellers truly removed boots at night during winter. Some accounts suggest boots stayed on more often than later romanticised. Others indicate removal was common when conditions allowed. Likely, both occurred. Context decided. Tonight removal was safe. You feel that safety in the absence of worry. Your feet are not calling for attention. That silence is earned. The cold presses gently around them, moderated by layers distance from ground and earlier decisions. You let go of active monitoring. The feet have checked in and reported all is well. As sleep approaches again, you notice how much of survival depends on listening early, rather than reacting late. Feet taught that lesson better than any story. Ignore them, and the night will teach you again harder. You curl slightly, drawing warmth inward. Feet tuck closer to your center. This instinctive movement conserves heat without conscious effort. The body remembers what works. Outside, the night remains unchanged. Snow rests, wind moves lightly. Inside your small pocket of managed warmth, the most vulnerable parts of you are protected. That protection allows rest. You breathe out slowly and feel the last of the day's tension leave your lower legs. The feet settle into stillness, satisfied for now. Sleep returns shallow but steady. The night continues its long stretch toward morning. With feet cared for, layers balanced, and hunger quiet, there is nothing urgent left to manage. You drift knowing that when dawn eventually arrives, it will arrive to feet that can carry you forward. On the frontier, that knowledge is not minor comfort, it is everything. Dreams change when cold presses close. They thin, first losing colour, and then detail, until what remains feels more like movement than story. You notice this as you surface briefly from sleep, aware that something passed through your mind, without leaving a clear trace. That absence does not bother you. It feels appropriate, as if the mind has simplified itself to match the environment. You drift again, and the dream returns, but not as a place you can describe. You are walking without effort. Snow does not resist your steps. The ground feels firm and reliable, offering support rather than challenge. There is no slipping, no sinking, no struggle to stay upright. This is not realism, it is a reassurance. The body practices ease when waking life offers little of it. Accounts from northern expeditions repeatedly note that people sleeping in extreme cold reported fewer elaborate dreams. Instead, they described impressions, direction, temperature, motion. The mind conserved energy the way the body did, trimming excess imagery. These observations appear across regions and decades, suggesting a pattern rather than coincidence. You notice that your dreams do not pull you far away from awareness. They hover close light enough to release at the slightest shift in temperature or sound. This closeness feels protective. You are not lost in narrative. You remain oriented. A small but intriguing detail appears in several winter diaries where writers mention dreaming of warmth without recalling images of fire or shelter. They dreamed instead of stillness, of being held of ground that did not drain heat. Comfort became abstract. The mind learned new symbols. You wake briefly, not fully, just enough to feel your breath. It is steady, slow. You let it continue without intervention. The dream dissolves easily, leaving behind a faint sense of direction rather than plot. You know which way is forward, even if you cannot say why. Researchers still debate whether these simplified dreams were caused primarily by cold-induced metabolic changes or by psychological adaptation to risk. Some suggest the brain reduces complex imagery when resources are limited. Others argue the mind mirrors environment out of habit. Lying here, it feels like cooperation rather than limitation. The mind is not deprived, it is efficient. You slip back into sleep and the dream shifts again. Now there is movement without scenery. You are travelling, but there are no landmarks, no obstacles, just motion and rhythm. Your breathing aligns with it. Inhale, exhale, step, step. The pattern soothes. A lesser-known anecdote from a fur trader's journal mentions dreaming of following a dog through snow without seeing the dog itself, only sensing direction and pace. The dream ended when the writer woke warmer than before. Whether coincidence or comfort mechanism, the experience stayed with him. Your own dreams do not linger long enough to analyse. They arrive, serve a purpose, and leave. This transience prevents emotional entanglement. Nothing dramatic plays out. Nothing demands interpretation. That simplicity allows deeper rest. You wake again, briefly aware of the cold touching your face. It is unchanged. That stability reassures you. Dreams do not need to warn you of danger tonight. They can afford to be gentle. There is ongoing scholarly interest in how frontier conditions reshaped dreaming over extended periods. Some suggest long exposure to monotony and risk led to dreams focused on bodily sensation rather than narrative resolution. Others argue people simply stopped writing about dreams unless they were unusual. The truth likely sits between perception and record keeping. You feel another dream forming, but you do not follow it consciously. It unfolds on its own terms. There is weightlessness, then warmth, then a sense of being carried forward without effort. You do not ask where. These dreams do not leave you disoriented when you wake. They fade cleanly, like breath on cold air. This cleanliness matters. Confusing dreams drain energy. Clear impressions restore it. Your body remains still as the mind moves lightly. This division of labour feels intentional. The body conserves heat. The mind practices calm motion. Together, they maintain balance. Outside, the night remains unchanged. Snow rests, wind holds steady. Inside, dreams continue their quiet work, smoothing edges, rehearsing ease. You drift in and out of this state without marking transitions. Sleep and waking blur, connected by simple sensations rather than story arcs. This is rest suited to winter. Not escape, but maintenance. Eventually, you surface again and realize you've been resting for some time. Not deeply unconscious, but not tense either. The dreams did their job. They did not entertain you. They steadied you. You let your eyes stay closed and allow another thin dream to pass through, trusting it to do whatever quiet work it needs to do. Out here, dreams are not messages or mysteries. They are tools trimming excess, conserving energy and guiding the mind through the long hours when the body must remain still. Wrapped in cold patience and muted imagery, you rest as the night continues, its slow, predictable arc toward morning. Illness waits until night to show itself. During the day, movement hides weakness. Muscles stay warm, blood keeps circulating, pain stays quiet. When the world slows and you finally stop, the body speaks more clearly. You wake with a faint sense that something is slightly off. Not pain, not fear, just imbalance. You lie still and listen inward. Breathing feels a little heavier than earlier. Not laboured, just slower to rise. Your chest expands with a touch more effort. You do not panic. Panic wastes energy. Instead, you assess the way frontier people learn to do, without tools or mirrors or numbers. Are you sweating? No. Sweat would mean overheating or fever. Are you shivering uncontrollably? No. Shivering would mean fuel or insulation failure. Is your breathing steady? Yes, even if it is deeper. That tells you enough for now. The body is adjusting, not failing. Winter travel records repeatedly emphasize that sickness became most dangerous after sundown. Fevers spiked when bodies stopped moving. Damp clothing cooled too fast. Minor respiratory issues worsened when cold air met exhaustion. Many people who functioned through the day collapsed quietly at night. This pattern appears so often that it reads less like coincidence and more like rule. You shift your focus to smaller signs: the inside of your mouth, dry or normal, the feeling behind your eyes, heavy or clear, the temperature of your hands compared to your core. These checks are subtle, almost meditative. They do not fully wake you. They simply inform. A curious note from a handful of winter diaries mentions people smelling sickness before fully recognizing it. A faint metallic taste, a sourness in the breath. Whether this was imagination or genuine sensory change remains unclear, but several writers described it independently. Out here, you paid attention to anything unusual. You adjust your collar slightly, opening it just enough to prevent moisture buildup from breath. Respiratory problems worsen when air stays too damp and warm near the face. This small adjustment costs little and may prevent more trouble later. Frontier medicine relied heavily on such preventative tweaks. You consider whether to drink water. Hydration matters, but cold water can chill the core. You decide to wait. The mouth is not dry enough to demand it. Waiting is often the better choice at night. There is sustained debate among historians about how well frontier people understood illness versus how much they simply endured it. Some argue knowledge was limited and outcomes were largely luck-driven. Others point to extensive practical wisdom that compensated for lack of formal medicine. Lying here, it feels less like ignorance and more like triage. You cannot fix everything. You can prevent escalation. Your breathing evens out as you stop monitoring it directly. The heaviness fades slightly. Perhaps it was only fatigue. Perhaps the cold pressed a little deeper earlier. Either way, the body seems content with your response. A lesser-known anecdote from a winter expedition recounts a man who woke nightly to check whether his breath fogged evenly. Uneven fog worried him. He believed it signaled lung trouble. Modern medicine might debate the accuracy, but the practice gave him something valuable: early awareness. You let your hands rest against your chest and feel warmth respond. The body still produces heat efficiently. That is a good sign. Serious illness steals heat production early. You think about how modern people often ignore early symptoms until they become loud. Out here, loud symptoms arrive too late. Frontier survival favoured those who noticed whispers. Researchers still explore whether winter sickness accounts overrepresent nighttime deterioration, because that was when people wrote or remembered most vividly. Daytime symptoms may have been underreported. Memory skews toward moments of vulnerability. Even so, the consistency of night-related decline across accounts suggests a real pattern. You decide no action is needed beyond awareness. That decision is not complacent, it is measured. Overreaction burns energy and disturbs rest. Underreaction courts danger. Balance again. You settle back into stillness, but not into denial. Awareness remains open, just less focused. If the body changes, you will notice. That trust allows rest to return. A small detail from fur trade correspondence mentions people sometimes sleeping with one layer loosened, specifically to detect chills sooner. Direct skin contact revealed changes faster than insulation. You already adjusted earlier. That foresight matters now. The night remains steady. No coughing, no sudden cold spikes. Breathing stays slow and deep. You feel reassured without feeling triumphant. Survival is not something you celebrate mid-process. You think briefly about how sickness shaped frontier decision-making. Illness often determined routes taken, days, rested journeys, abandoned. Strength was not just physical power, it was resilience and awareness. There is an ongoing scholarly discussion about whether frontier communities developed informal diagnostic language shared among travelers. Some evidence suggests phrases like chest tightness or night heaviness carried specific meanings. Others argue these were vague descriptors rather than standardized terms. Either way, people understood each other well enough to act. You drift towards sleep again, confident that tonight your body is managing what it needs to manage. The slight imbalance has not grown, it has settled. That is enough for now. Sleep returns lightly. You do not sink deeply. You hover in that middle space where awareness can rise quickly, if needed. This is not anxiety, it is habit. As minutes pass, the earlier concern fades further into the background. The body warms, breathing remains smooth. The night offers no new challenges. You rest with the quiet understanding that illness does not announce itself with drama. It whispers. Out here, survival depended on listening without panic and acting without delay. Tonight, listening was enough. Wrapped in layers and patience, you allow sleep to carry you onward, trusting that your body will wake you if it truly needs something. Until then, the night remains calm, and so do you. There are nights when the safest thing you can do is nothing at all. Storm nights teach this lesson without mercy. Movement feels productive. It feels brave. It feels like control. But when the wind commits and snow thickens into something almost solid, stillness becomes strategy. You sense it before the storm fully arrives. The air pressure shifts, sound flattens. Snow no longer drifts lightly, but presses, accumulating with intent. The wind stops gusting and settles into a steady push like a hand on your shoulder that does not let go. This is the kind of night that punishes travel and rewards patience. Many winter travel narratives from the interior West describe storms not as sudden events, but as conditions that closed in gradually, like a door being shut room by room. People who tried to outrun them often failed. Those who stayed put, conserving heat and energy, survived more reliably. This pattern appears so consistently that it reads less like advice and more like law. You lie still and resist the urge to check everything again. Checking creates gaps. Gaps invite cold. You already made your decisions earlier, when daylight allowed judgment. Night is not the time for revisions, unless something has clearly failed. Nothing has? The wind tests the shelter again. It presses and slides away, unable to find leverage. Snow builds where it helps and avoids where it would harm. The fire remains low and protected. Animals remain calm. These are all confirmations. Stillness is working. A curious detail from several storm night accounts describes travelers deliberately ignoring the sound of wind battering shelters once they had confirmed stability. Listening too closely increased anxiety without improving outcomes. Experienced people learned when to stop monitoring and start trusting. You remember earlier storms, ones that tempted you to move. Nights when you packed hurriedly, convinced that action equaled safety. Those nights taught you otherwise. Cold compounds mistakes, movement drains reserves quickly. Once wet or exhausted options vanish. There is ongoing scholarly discussion about whether frontier travelers truly understood storm dynamics, or whether survival often came down to chance. Some argue knowledge of weather patterns was rudimentary at best. Others point to extensive observational skill developed through necessity. Lying here, you feel the difference between ignorance and restraint. You may not predict the storm's end, but you know enough not to challenge it. The storm sound becomes the dominant feature of the night. It fills space, replaces smaller noises. This can feel overwhelming if you let it. Instead, you allow it to become background, like a river heard from inside a tent. Constant but non-urgent. Snow presses against the shelter, adding weight and insulation at the same time. This duality defines winter storms. They threaten collapse if ignored and provide protection if managed. Tonight, accumulation remains within limits. You can tell by the absence of strain sounds. No creaking poles, no shifting fabric. A lesser-known anecdote from a winter crossing describes a man who attempted to adjust his shelter repeatedly during a storm, chasing small drafts. By morning he was exhausted and colder than his companions who had stayed still. The lesson spread quietly. Fix what is broken, endure what is not. You check your own state. Warm enough, dry, fed, awake just enough. That is sufficient. The storm can do what it will outside. Inside your small pocket of preparation, there is no need to intervene. The wind howls louder for a moment, then settles back into its steady pressure. You do not flinch. Startled responses cost energy. Calm preserves it. The frontier taught people to separate sound from threat, especially during weather events that could not be fought anyway. Researchers still debate whether storm survival owed more to shelter quality or to decision-making. Evidence suggests both mattered, but judgment often mattered more. A mediocre shelter used wisely outperformed a good one used poorly. You let your breathing slow further, matching the storm's rhythm instead of resisting it. Inhale during quieter moments. Exhale as the wind rises. This unconscious synchronization reduces tension. The body relaxes even as the environment intensifies. The animals remain steady. The horse stands with its head lowered, angled away from the wind. The dog stays curled, nose tucked. Their calm reinforces your own. If they are not expending energy, neither should you. Snowfall thickens briefly, then steadies. Visibility outside shrinks, but that does not concern you. You are not going anywhere. Movement now would only expose you to what the storm controls. There is an academic conversation about whether frontier culture valued endurance over action because of environmental pressure. Some suggest this shaped broader social attitudes toward patience and restraint. Nights like this offer a clue. Endurance here is not passive. It is active choice. You feel the night stretch heavy with sound and motion. Beyond your shelter, inside time slows. Minutes feel longer but not oppressive. You have accepted the terms. Eventually, without any clear signal, the storm begins to lose intensity. Wind softens, snowfall lightens. This shift is subtle. You do not celebrate it. You simply register the change and remain still. Storms have false endings. You wait. Waiting costs nothing now. Action would cost plenty. Sleep returns in shallow waves threaded with the sound of wind. You do not fight it. The storm will last as long as it lasts. Your job is to remain intact until it passes. Wrapped in layers of fabric, habit, and restraint, you let the storm spend itself outside. Stillness holds. That choice, more than any heroic effort, keeps you alive through the wildest winter nights on the frontier. Before sleep fully claims you, there is always a quiet rehearsal. It does not look like planning. It feels more like imagining without urgency. You picture waking suddenly and needing to move. You do this not to frighten yourself, but to remove surprise from the equation. Surprise wastes its time. Time costs heat. You imagine the motion first, rolling slightly to one side, knees drawing in, one hand leaving warmth only long enough to find what it already knows is there. You do not sit up in this mental run-through. Sitting exposes your core and breaks insulation. You imagine standing only after everything else is ready. Sequence matters. This kind of rehearsal appears again and again in winter journals, though rarely named. Travellers wrote about knowing what they would do if something happened. They did not describe anxiety, they described certainty. That knowing reduced hesitation, and hesitation was expensive. You feel how this mental practice calms rather than excites. The nervous system relaxes when options are pre-arranged. The body does not need to stay tense if it knows the order of operations. This is not fantasizing danger. It is smoothing response. You picture the night changing in small ways. A sound closer than expected. A shift in wind that finds a weakness. An animal moving abruptly. None of these images linger. You touch them lightly, confirm your response, and let them go. The goal is familiarity, not fear. There is a fascinating detail mentioned in several winter travel accounts, where experienced men described mentally practicing movements while already half asleep. They believed the mind was more receptive, then closer to the state they would be in if woken suddenly. Whether this made a measurable difference is unclear, but those who did it swore by the habit. You notice how your breathing stays slow as you rehearse. Heart rate does not rise, muscles do not tense. This tells you the practice is working. If imagining movement made you anxious, you would stop. Anxiety burns fuel without producing action. The frontier demanded this kind of preparation because conditions allowed little margin for error. Night removed sight, cold removed dexterity, fatigue removed clarity. What remained was muscle memory and sequence. Rehearsal fed both. There is ongoing debate among historians about whether such practices were consciously taught or simply emerged through repeated exposure. Some argue they were learned behaviours passed informally among experienced travellers. Others suggest the body naturally adopts them when conditions demand. Lying here, it feels instinctive, but shaped by experience. You imagine reaching for your boots, not putting them on yet, just touching them, orienting them. You imagine the stiffness of leather in cold, how it resists at first and then yields. You picture how long it would take to stand without rushing. Rushing would cost balance. Balance costs less than speed. You imagine the fire needing attention. You see yourself feeding it slowly, not all at once. One piece of wood, then waiting. The goal is not flame but recovery of heat. You do not picture panic, you picture method. A curious anecdote from a winter expedition letter describes a man who credited his survival during a night collapse to having mentally rehearsed how to free himself from tangled bedding. When it happened, his hands moved without conscious thought. He later wrote that the lack of surprise mattered more than strength. You allow the images to fade once they have served their purpose. Rehearsal ends where rumination begins. You stop before that line. The mind needs rest too. You check in with your body again. Still warm, still steady. The act of imagining has not disturbed your balance. Good. You let your shoulders sink further into the bedroll. Mental rehearsal also creates permission to sleep. When you know what you would do, you do not need to stay half awake guarding against uncertainty. Preparation replaces vigilance. That trade is essential out here. There is scholarly discussion about whether frontier culture valued this quiet preparedness. because of constant exposure to risk, or whether such habits were exaggerated later to fit narratives of competence. Evidence suggests risk-shaped behavior more than storytelling. People adapted because adaptation was rewarded immediately. You let one final image pass through your mind. Dawn light filtering weakly through snow. The night loosening its grip. You do not dwell on it. Morning is not guaranteed. It does not need to be imagined in detail. It only needs to remain possible. Your thoughts slow again. The rehearsal is complete. You do not repeat it. Repetition without need wastes energy. The mind releases the sequence, confident it can retrieve it if required. Sleep approaches deeper now. Not oblivion, but rest with structure beneath it. Your body knows where to go. Your mind knows what comes first. That knowledge creates space for stillness. You drift carrying no tension about what might happen. You have already visited those possibilities and returned unharmed. The night remains unchanged. Snow rests, wind holds, animals are calm. Mental rehearsal fades into the background, becoming part of the same fabric as shelter and clothing. Another layer of insulation, invisible but effective. As sleep finally deepens, you're not caught unprepared. You're simply resting within a system you assembled piece by piece, choice by choice. Out here, that is as close to safety as anyone ever came. The frontier night continues around you, indifferent but predictable. You let it be what it is. Your work is done for now. You learn over time that silence is not always your ally. At first it feels reassuring, a sign that nothing is wrong. Later you realize silence can mislead. It can flatten detail, erase warning, and make danger feel farther away than it is. Noise at least announces itself honestly. Silence requires interpretation. You lie still and listen to the quiet, but you no longer trust it blindly. Silence out here is contextual. It only means safety when paired with other confirmations. Animals calm, wind steady, fire breathing. When silence arrives alone without those companions, it raises questions rather than answers. Many frontier winter accounts note this distinction indirectly. Travelers wrote less about frightening noises than about unsettling absences. The lack of expected sounds often drew more attention than sudden disturbances. Silence could mean snow muffling the world, or it could mean something moving carefully. You take inventory of the night's usual background. The horse shifts occasionally. The dog breathes softly. The fire settles. Wind brushes the shelter in familiar patterns. These sounds remain present, even if faint. That matters. Silence layered over activity feels different from silence that replaces it. There is a curious observation in several winter journals describing moments when animals went unnaturally still. Not alarmed, not restless, just quiet. Writers often marked these moments with unease even when nothing followed. Whether these instincts were accurate or remembered selectively is difficult to say, but the pattern appears often enough to notice. You remain calm but attentive. Silence does not trigger action by itself. It triggers awareness. You widen your listening rather than narrowing it. This takes less effort than you might expect. The body adapts quickly. The frontier taught people to distrust simple signals. One cue rarely told the whole story. Instead, meaning emerged from combinations. Silence plus snow behaved differently than silence plus wind. Silence after sound meant something else entirely. There is ongoing scholarly conversation about whether frontier narratives overemphasize the menace of silence due to retrospective framing. Some suggest writers amplified moments of quiet to heighten drama. Others argue that silence genuinely carried risk because it masked approach and change. Sitting here, you feel the truth lies in pattern recognition rather than fear. You notice how your own breathing interacts with the quiet. Too loud, and it fills the space. Too controlled, and it creates tension. You settle into a natural rhythm that neither dominates nor disappears. You become part of the soundscape rather than an observer outside it. A lesser-known detail from a winter trapper's account mentions deliberately creating a small consistent noise at night, such as the faint crackle of embers or the creak of leather shifting in wind. This gave a baseline against which silence could be measured. Without baseline, sound change was harder to detect. Tonight the fire provides that reference. Its soft presence anchors the quiet. You know what the night sounds like when nothing is wrong. That knowledge allows silence to relax rather than alarm you. You recall earlier nights when silence felt oppressive. Those were often nights of uncertainty when you were new to the environment. Experience changes perception. Familiar silence feels different than unknown quiet. Familiar silence carries structure. Researchers still examine how prolonged exposure to natural quiet affected frontier cognition. Some suggest it heightened sensitivity to subtle change. Others argue it led to false positives, mistaking normal variation for threat. Likely, both occurred with experience determining accuracy. You feel no urgency now. Silence does not demand movement, it invites listening. You let awareness stretch gently outward without stiffening your body. Snow shifts faintly, somewhere beyond the shelter. The sound is almost imagined, almost. You register it and move on. Not everything needs response. Filtering matters as much as detection. Silence returns, but it no longer feels empty. It feels full of known elements held in balance. This fullness allows you to rest within it. You think briefly about how modern environments rarely allow true silence. Machines hum, systems buzz. Out here, silence feels heavier because it contains more information. It is not absence, it is compression. The night remains stable. Silence persists, supported by the soft confirmations that surround it. You allow your mind to drift without losing contact. Sleep returns lightly, layered over listening. Silence no longer threatens. It becomes another texture of the night, something to feel rather than solve. You rest understanding now that silence is neither friend nor enemy. It is a condition like cold or snow. Managed properly, it offers clarity. Misread, it misleads. Tonight you read it correctly. The quiet holds. The night continues without interruption. Wrapped in stillness that has been tested and understood, you drift onward, carried by a silence that finally feels honest enough to trust. Wind never behaves randomly for long. It reads the land the way water does, searching for low points, edges, weaknesses. You learn to feel this rather than calculate it. Lying still, you sense how air moves around the shelter, how pressure builds and releases. Wind is not just noise, it is information written across your skin. Earlier, before night fully arrived, you watched the wind test the terrain. It slid downhill, curled around trees, pressed harder in open spaces. That observation shaped where you stopped. Now in darkness, you feel the results of that choice. Wind brushes past instead of through. It touches the shelter, then moves on, unable to settle. Accounts from winter travel across the plains and mountain corridors repeatedly note that wind, more than temperature, alone determines survival outcomes. People endured extreme cold if wind was managed. Far milder temperatures became lethal when exposure was constant. This reality appears in military records, trader letters, and emigrant journals alike. You listen to how the wind sounds against different surfaces. Canvas produces a low, steady murmur. Snow dampens it further. Trees create a soft, uneven whisper. Rock sends it upward, sharper, less forgiving. Each sound maps the space around you without requiring sight. A small but intriguing observation from several frontier diaries describes travellers orienting their shelters slightly off-axis from prevailing wind, not head-on or fully away, but angled just enough to encourage air to slide past rather than pile up. This subtlety was learned through nights like this one, not diagrams. You feel the wind change direction slightly, not abruptly. Just a slow shift. The shelter responds well. No new drafts appear. That confirmation allows you to relax further. Wind that changes gradually is easier to manage than sudden gusts. The night feels cooperative. There has long been academic discussion about how much formal knowledge frontier travellers had about wind behaviour versus how much was intuitive. Some historians argue that concepts like wind shadow and turbulence were understood practically long before they were named. Others suggest people simply followed rules of thumb without deeper comprehension. Out here, understanding feels embodied rather than articulated. You notice how wind affects temperature perception. The air touching your face feels colder when the wind strengthens, even if actual temperature remains unchanged. This distinction mattered. Experienced travellers adjusted layers in response to wind, not cold alone. Wind strips heat invisibly. Clothing and shelter exist to interrupt that theft. You adjust your collar slightly, not to block air entirely, but to redirect it. Small changes have outsized effects. You feel the result immediately. Less bite, more stability. You stop adjusting. Overcorrection invites new problems. A lesser-known detail from a winter expedition notes mentions people deliberately creating rough surfaces on the windward side of shelters using brush or uneven snow to break airflow. Smooth surfaces encouraged faster wind. Texture slowed it. This principle applied to clothing as well. Fur outperformed smooth hides for a reason. The wind outside continues its quiet movement, never still, never aggressive enough to demand action. You allow it to exist without interpretation. It is not threatening tonight, it is simply present. You think briefly about how modern buildings insulate people from wind so completely that they forget its role. Out here, wind is as important as temperature, sometimes more so. You do not curse it, you account for it. Scholars still examine whether frontier travellers overemphasized wind in their accounts, because it was more perceptible than temperature. Cold could be abstract, wind was felt immediately. Either way, the focus shaped behaviour. Shelter choices, travel routes. Camp placement all revolved around air movement. You feel the wind pass again, sliding over the shelter like water over stone. That imagery comforts you. Stone endures by allowing flow, not resisting it. Tonight your setup does the same. Your breathing stays slow. Wind no longer intrudes on your awareness. It becomes background texture, like distant surf. This shift signals that conditions are stable enough for deeper rest. Snow shifts lightly, somewhere above as wind redistributes it. The sound is soft, unhurried. No collapse follows. The structure holds. Wind and snow negotiate without involving you. You let your mind drift again, trusting that if wind behaviour changes in a way that matters, your body will notice. That trust is earned through repetition. Nights like this teach you what normal feels like. The frontier demanded this kind of literacy. Reading wind was not poetic, it was practical. Those who misread it paid quickly. Those who listened without overreacting lasted longer. You rest now, feeling how wind moves around you rather than against you. That distinction matters. You are not battling the night, you are positioned within it. As awareness softens, wind fades further into the background. It does not disappear, it simply stops asking for attention. The night continues its long, quiet progression, guided by forces larger than you, but not hostile. Wrapped in shelter, shaped by land and habit, you allow sleep to deepen again, knowing that the wind has read the terrain and moved on, leaving you undisturbed in its wake. Time behaves strangely out here, especially at night. Without clocks or lamps to mark progress, hours stretch and contract in ways that feel personal. A few minutes can feel long enough to matter. Long stretches pass without leaving much trace at all. You stop trying to measure it. Measurement implies control, and control is mostly an illusion on winter nights. You wake briefly and feel as if a great deal of night has passed. Then later, you wake again and sense almost no change at all. Both impressions feel true. The mind, untethered from routine signals, begins to track time by sensation instead. Cold deepens, then steadies. Hunger murmurs, then quiets. Fatigue ebbs and returns in waves. These become your markers. Frontier journals often remark on this distortion without analysing it. Writers noted nights that felt endless and mornings that arrived unexpectedly soon. Time was described as heavy, or thin, slow, or slippery. These were not metaphors meant for readers. They were attempts to capture a lived confusion. You notice that when you stop thinking about time, it bothers you less. Waiting for dawn makes the night feel longer. Letting the night be itself allows it to pass more gently. This is another frontier lesson. Anticipation drains energy. Presence conserves it. A curious aside from a winter traveller's letter describes a man who stopped estimating hours altogether after weeks outdoors. He measured night by the number of times he adjusted his bedroll or checked the fire. Time became procedural rather than numerical. This shift reduced frustration and improved rest. You feel your own sense of sequence loosening. Sleep and wake blend together. You're not sure how long you've been lying here, and you realize you do not care. The night does not need to be conquered. It only needs to be endured. There is continuing academic interest in whether this altered sense of time had lasting effects on people who lived extended periods on the frontier. Some scholars suggest it fostered patience and tolerance for uncertainty. Others argue it created disorientation that faded once routines returned. Lying here, it feels adaptive rather than damaging. The fire glows faintly unchanged. Animals remain calm. Wind holds steady. These constants anchor you more than any clock could. You trust them to tell you if something matters. You drift again, and this time, sleep settles a little deeper. When you surface later, you feel slightly warmer. That tells you something has changed, even if you cannot say how long it took. The body keeps its own time. Snow outside reflects faint starlight now that clouds have thinned. You notice this without opening your eyes, sensing a subtle change in brightness through the shelter. Dawn is still far off, but the night has shifted. This is how time announces itself, here softly, indirectly. A lesser-known observation from winter camps mentions people judging the approach of morning by sound rather than light. Birds stirred differently. Wind changed texture. Even silence altered. Time revealed itself through behaviour, not numbers. You breathe slowly and let these impressions wash over you without organising them. Organising would wake you fully. Instead, you allow the night to pass in its own rhythm. The idea of time as a straight line fades. It feels more like a tide rising and falling, carrying you with it. You are not behind. You are not ahead. You are simply within it. You wake again briefly and realize you have stopped checking altogether. This is the deepest rest the frontier allows. When concern about duration disappears, sleep comes more easily. Time out here is not something you spend. It is something you occupy. That distinction changes everything. You are not losing hours. You are moving through them. As awareness softens once more, the night continues its slow work around you. Minutes pass unnoticed. Hours fold into one another. Somewhere ahead, morning exists, but it does not pull at you. Wrapped in cold patience and a loosened sense of sequence, you rest within a night that no longer feels long or short. It simply feels sufficient, carrying you forward without asking you to keep track. Clocks lose their authority out here, so small rituals take over. Not grand routines, just quiet habits that tell you where you are in the night without demanding precision. You do not know the hour, but you know the state. That is enough. You surface briefly and notice your mouth feels slightly dry, not enough to wake fully, just enough to register. Earlier in the night, this sensation would have meant nothing. Now it suggests that a certain stretch of hours has passed. You roll your tongue, swallow, and let it go. No water yet. The body is still balanced. Frontier accounts often describe nights measured by bodily cues rather than instruments. Travellers wrote about waking when feet cooled, when embers dulled, when animals shifted posture. These signals replaced bells and dials. They were reliable because they were internal. You feel your hands now, warm but not flushed. That tells you circulation remains steady. You do not need to adjust layers. The ritual here is awareness, not action. Checking without changing preserves energy. There is a small tradition mentioned in several winter camp letters of people gently pressing a palm to the ground beneath their bedding at intervals during the night. The Earth's temperature revealed how insulation was holding. If the ground felt sharply cold, something above needed attention. Whether widespread or personal, the practice reflects how bodies became instruments. You perform a version of this without thinking. Pressure through fabric. A sense of cold but muted. Acceptable. You withdraw your hand and return it to warmth. Ritual complete. These small check-ins anchor you. They create rhythm where clocks cannot. Wake, notice, confirm, rest. Each cycle marks passage without measuring it. There is active debate among historians about whether such bodily timekeeping was consciously taught or simply emerged through necessity. Some argue seasoned travellers passed down these habits deliberately. Others suggest they arose organically in anyone exposed long enough. Either way, the outcome was the same. People stopped asking what time it was and started asking what condition they were in. You notice the fire's glow has shifted slightly, more ember than flame. That tells you another segment of night has passed. Not how many minutes, just that fuel is doing its slow work. You decide no adjustment is needed. The ritual here is restraint. Snow outside creaks faintly as temperature changes. The sound is subtle, almost imagined. You have heard it enough times to recognize it. Snow expanding, settling. Another marker. Night is moving. A lesser-known observation from a winter survey expedition describes people humming very softly to themselves during wakeful moments. Not to pass time, but to feel vibration in the chest. The sound confirmed breath depth and warmth. You do not hum now, but you understand the impulse. The body seeks confirmation. You breathe in, slowly feeling expansion. You breathe out, feeling release. Breath becomes both ritual and measurement. When it flows easily, things are well. You think briefly about how modern life trains people to outsource time to devices. Out here, time is felt. This makes it less precise but more humane. You are not racing it, you are accompanying it. Scholars continue to examine how this shift affected decision-making. Some suggest reliance on bodily cues, improved judgment under stress. Others argue it increased vulnerability to misinterpretation. Both likely happened. Experience refined accuracy. You drift again, and when you return to awareness later, you notice a faint change in the air. Slightly less dense, slightly easier to breathe. This suggests the deepest cold has passed even if dawn is still distant. The body recognizes this long before the mind names it. Another ritual completes itself without ceremony. You flex your toes once. Sensation answers. No need to move further. This check has become automatic. The night no longer feels endless. It feels segmented not into hours but into states of balance. Each state arrives, holds, then yields to the next. You rest within this system without effort. The rituals do not keep you awake. They allow sleep to return quickly because nothing feels unattended. Out here, survival was not maintained by constant action, but by these small repeated confirmations. People lasted because they listened early and responded lightly. You let awareness fade, again confident that when the next ritual moment arrives, your body will perform it without instruction. Time will continue to move quietly, marked not by numbers, but by sensation, breath, and the steady negotiation between warmth and cold. Wrapped in this gentle rhythm, you drift onward through the night, carried by rituals so small, they barely feel like effort, yet strong enough to guide you until morning finally chooses to arrive. Loneliness does not arrive the way people expect it to. It does not crash in with sadness or drama. Out here it seeps in quietly, then often fades just as quietly once routine takes over. The night feels large, yes, but it does not feel empty. Tasks, checks, and small decisions fill the space where loneliness might otherwise settle. You lie alone, but you do not feel abandoned. The shelter holds, the fire persists, animals breathe nearby. Even the snow pressing gently against fabric feels like company of a sort. The frontier teaches you that solitude and loneliness are not the same thing. Solitude is a condition. Loneliness is a reaction, and reactions change. Many first-hand winter accounts mention long stretches of isolation without complaint. Writers focused on weather, equipment, and routine rather than emotion. This does not mean they felt nothing, it means feeling took a backseat to function. Emotion was not denied, it was deprioritized. You notice how repetition dulls the sharp edges of being alone. Each night resembles the last just enough to feel familiar. Familiarity breeds calm. Calm leaves little room for spiraling thought. You do not replay conversations. You do not imagine distant places. The night asks for presence, not memory. There is a curious note in a trader's winter letter describing how men who initially struggled with isolation often settled into it after a week or two, while those who remained restless tended to make mistakes. Loneliness, when indulged, distracted. Routine anchored attention. You feel that anchoring now. Your mind returns again and again to physical sensation. Breath, warmth, pressure, sound. These concrete experiences crowd out abstract longing. The body lives here, the mind follows. Ongoing scholarly discussion explores whether frontier isolation reshaped emotional expression over time. Some researchers suggest prolonged solitude, reduced reliance on social reinforcement, increasing self-regulation. Others argue it simply compressed emotional range temporarily. Lying here, it feels less like loss and more like narrowing, a focusing rather than a flattening. You think briefly of people far away, not with ache, but with neutrality. They exist, you exist here. Both are true without conflict. The frontier encourages this kind of compartmentalization. It is not denial, it is prioritization. A lesser-known anecdote from a winter trapping account describes a man who spoke aloud to his tools at night, not because he imagined they listened, but because hearing his own voice grounded him. He stopped after a few weeks, no longer needing it. The routine replaced the reassurance. You remain silent. Silence feels natural now, not imposed. You do not need to fill it. The night is already full. You notice how the absence of social interaction simplifies identity. You are not performing. You are not explaining. You are simply maintaining. This simplicity feels lighter than expected. Without mirrors, you become functional rather than narrative. The fire settles further. The sound is familiar. It has become part of the environment rather than an object of focus. That transition mirrors how solitude works. At first it stands out, then it blends. Researchers still debate whether frontier solitude was romanticized later or underreported at the time. Some suggest writers minimized emotional struggle to project competence. Others point out that constant hardship left little energy for reflection. The truth likely lies somewhere between resilience and restraint. You feel no urge to count days or nights. Tracking duration feeds restlessness. Instead, you accept the night you are in. That acceptance reduces friction. Loneliness thrives on comparison. Presence dissolves it. Your body relaxes further as emotional background noise fades. The mind has fewer places to wander. Thoughts slow. This calm is not forced. It arrives naturally when nothing demands performance. Snow shifts lightly outside. The sound is soft, unthreatening. You register it and let it pass. Even the environment seems companionable tonight, predictable, consistent. You think briefly about how modern loneliness often comes from disconnection amid noise, not silence. Here, silence connects you to immediate reality. That connection satisfies something fundamental. There is an academic argument that frontier solitude fostered a form of emotional self-sufficiency that persisted even when people returned to settled life. Some evidence suggests former trappers and guides remained comfortable alone long after. Others found reintegration difficult. Experience reshaped expectations. You drift again, and when you surface, you feel the same quiet steadiness. No longing has crept in, no worry has taken hold. Routine continues to do its work. Loneliness, when it does appear, is brief and manageable. It does not dominate. It passes like cold gusts acknowledged and endured. You settle deeper into the bedroll, feeling supported by layers of habit rather than people. This is not isolation as punishment. It is solitude as structure. The night continues without interruption. You remain alone but not lonely. The distinction matters. It allows rest to deepen without emotional friction. As awareness softens again, you realize that routine has done more than keep you warm. It has kept you company. Tasks, checks, and quiet awareness have filled the space where loneliness might have grown. Wrapped in stillness and repetition, you drift onward through the night, carried not by thoughts of others, but by the steady presence of what is here now, and sufficient until morning finds you again. Fear does not disappear out here. It changes volume. Early on, it speaks loudly, narrating every unknown sound, every shadow. Over time, exposure turns that voice into background noise. Fear remains present, but it no longer directs your actions. It becomes one input among many, not the loudest one. You remember how the first winter nights felt sharper, how every creak pulled you toward full wakefulness. That intensity fades with repetition. The body learns what belongs and what does not. Familiar danger feels different than imagined danger. The frontier teaches this distinction relentlessly. Historical records from long-distance winter travel show that newcomers were far more likely to make risky decisions during night hours than experienced travelers. Panic-fueled movement. Movement-fueled mistakes. Veterans, by contrast, often reported feeling less afraid over time, even as conditions worsened. Experience dulled fear's edge without erasing awareness. You feel that dulling now. A sound reaches you and registers without spike. The wind rises slightly, and you note it without tightening. Fear still exists, but it does not hijack your body. This is not bravery. It is calibration. There is a small but telling anecdote in a winter diary describing a man who admitted that after his third season, he stopped feeling afraid of the dark entirely and started fearing daylight mistakes more. Night was predictable. Day brought choices. That inversion says a great deal about how fear reorganizes itself with familiarity. You notice how fear, when reduced, frees up attention. Instead of scanning constantly, you listen selectively. Instead of bracing, you rest. This efficiency matters. Fear burns energy. Background fear costs less than foreground panic. Researchers continue to debate whether frontier culture actively suppressed expressions of fear, or whether fear simply diminished through repeated exposure. Some argue social norms discouraged admitting vulnerability. Others point to neurological adaptation. Lying here, it feels less like suppression and more like desensitization paired with respect. You feel a brief ripple of unease when the shelter shifts slightly. It passes quickly once you identify the cause. Snow settling, no threat. Fear rose, informed you, and stepped aside. This is how it should work. A curious detail from several expedition accounts notes that experienced winter travelers often felt more uneasy during calm, mild nights than during severe storms. The storms were obvious. Calm conditions masked change. Fear adapted to probability, not intensity. You breathe steadily, allowing fear to exist without amplifying it. This approach keeps it useful. Fear alerts, it should not command. The night continues unchanged. No escalation, no surprises. Fear quiets further, blending into the same layer as cold and wind. Present but managed. There is scholarly discussion around whether this adaptation had costs later in life. Some suggest reduced fear response persisted, creating difficulty in settled environments where caution mattered differently. Others argue people recalibrated easily once context changed. Adaptation was situational. You think briefly about how modern life often triggers fear without immediate consequence. Alerts, headlines, artificial urgency. Out here, fear is tied directly to feedback. It rises when something changes. It falls when stability returns. That clarity makes it easier to live with. You drift towards sleep again, noticing that fear no longer disrupts the transition. It does not pull you back. It allows rest. This is perhaps the clearest sign of adaptation. When fear stops interfering with sleep, it has found its proper place. The wind steadies, snow remains quiet, animals are calm. Fear has nothing new to say. You sink deeper, wrapped in layers of fabric and experience. The frontier night holds steady, and fear once so loud now murmurs softly in the background, doing its job without demanding attention. Memory lives in your muscles long before it settles into words. Out here you rely on that kind of memory more than anything you could explain. You do not think through each action step by step. You simply move when needed, guided by patterns laid down through repetition. The body remembers what the mind might forget under pressure. You feel this embodied knowledge even while resting. The way your knees draw in without instruction. The way your shoulders angle to protect heat. The way your hand would reach for a tool if the night demanded it. None of this requires conscious planning anymore. It has been rehearsed too many times. A well-documented reality from frontier travel is that experienced trappers and guides often describe themselves as acting automatically in emergencies. They did not frame this as instinct in the romantic sense, but as habit. Actions practiced in calm moments surfaced reliably during crisis. Habits replaced deliberation. You notice how this kind of memory allows deeper rest. When the body knows what to do, the mind does not need to stay vigilant. You are not keeping a mental checklist. You trust the system you have built into yourself. There is an interesting aside in a winter expedition journal where a man wrote that after several seasons, he could pack camp in the darks without fully waking. His hands moved correctly, while his thoughts drifted elsewhere. He found this both unsettling and reassuring. The body had taken over. You test this lightly by imagining a movement again. Not rehearsal this time, just awareness. The response is immediate. Your muscles recognize the pattern. No hesitation. That recognition brings calm rather than tension. Scholars still debate whether this reliance on muscle memory reduced adaptability or enhanced it. Some argue rigid habits can fail when conditions change. Others suggest embodied skill frees mental capacity to notice change. Out here, it feels like the latter. Habit handles the familiar so attention can remain available for the unexpected. You lie still feeling how your body occupies space efficiently. No limb sprawls unnecessarily. No area is left exposed. This efficiency was not chosen consciously. It emerged from nights that punished inefficiency. A lesser-known detail from fur trade correspondence mentions men struggling to explain their methods to newcomers because so much of what they did could not be verbalized. They showed rather than told. Watching mattered more than listening. You feel the truth of that now. If someone asked you why you sleep the way you do, you might struggle to answer. You could describe the outcome, not the process. The body holds the knowledge quietly. This embodied memory extends beyond physical movement. It includes timing, when to adjust, when to wait, when to ignore a sound. These decisions feel immediate, not reasoned. They are not guesses, they are recognition. There is ongoing academic interest in how this form of learning shaped frontier education. Formal instruction mattered less than apprenticeship and observation. Skills were transmitted through shared space and repetition rather than explanation. The night was a classroom that tested lessons immediately. You relax further as you recognize how much of the work has already been done for you by experience. You do not need to stay alert to remember what to do. Your body will handle it if needed. The fire remains steady. Wind moves predictably. Animals stay calm. No action is required. Habit allows you to rest without fear of forgetting something important. You drift again, and when you surface briefly, you notice that nothing has changed. Your position remains efficient. Warmth holds. This consistency reinforces trust in your own embodied knowledge. Modern life often separates thinking from doing. Out here, they merge. Thinking happens through movement, posture, and restraint. The body becomes the primary decision maker. Researchers continue to examine whether this shift influenced how frontier people approached problem solving later in life. Some suggest it fostered practical intuition, others argue it limited abstract reasoning. The evidence is mixed. What is clear is that in this environment, embodied knowledge saved lives. You breathe slowly, feeling the bedroll support your weight exactly where it should. No conscious adjustment needed. The system holds. As sleep deepens, muscle memory does not disappear. It waits quietly beneath rest, ready to surface if required. This quiet readiness is not tension, it is assurance. The night continues its steady passage. You do not track it. Your body does that for you. Memory stored in muscle carries you forward without effort. Wrapped in habit and repetition, you rest knowing that if the night asks something of you, your response will come. Before thought shaped by nights, just like this one, you begin to picture morning long before it arrives. Not vividly, not optimistically, just as a quiet reference point. Dawn is not a promise out here. It is a possibility, one you hold lightly, because holding it too tightly turns waiting into strain. Still, the mind returns to it now, and then using it as orientation rather than goal. You imagine the light first, not the sun itself, but the change it brings. The way darkness loosens its grip, gradually thinning at the edges. The way shapes separate from one another again. Trees becoming vertical instead of mass. Snow gaining texture. Morning is not an event. It is a slow redefinition of space. Frontier writings often described dawn less as relief and more as confirmation. Night had passed. Systems had held. The body had endured. Many travellers noted that they did not feel triumphant at sunrise, only steady. Survival was cumulative, not dramatic. You let the image fade once it has done its work. Imagining morning too clearly can make the night feel longer. You have learned that lesson. Instead, you allow the idea of dawn to sit in the background, like a marker on a distant horizon that does not pull at you. You wake briefly and notice the air feels different, not warmer exactly, but less heavy. This subtle shift often precedes light. The body senses it before the eyes ever will. You take it as information, nothing more. A curious observation appears in several winter camp journals, where writers mention dreaming of daylight shortly before it arrived, even when clouds obscured all visual cues. Some believed the body sensed environmental changes through pressure and temperature. Others dismissed it as coincidence. Either way, the pattern was noticed. You think about how planning for morning shaped decisions at night. Tools were placed for easy access. Clothing loosened but not removed. Food was rationed with the next day in mind. Morning influenced behaviour long before it appeared. This forward orientation was practical, not hopeful. There is ongoing discussion among historians about whether frontier travellers were overly focused on dawn as a psychological anchor. Some argue it provided motivation that reduced despair. Others suggest too much focus increased impatience and risk-taking. The most consistent accounts describe a balanced approach. Morning mattered, but only when it arrived. You feel that balance now. Dawn exists as context, not pressure. You are not counting minutes. You are not reaching for it. You simply know it is part of the cycle. Snow outside reflects a faint change in ambient light, barely perceptible. You do not open your eyes to confirm it. Trusting sensation costs less than checking. The body reads what it needs to read. A lesser-known detail from a winter expedition diary describes people timing their first movements of the day, carefully waiting until light was sufficient to see without fire, but not so bright that snow glare strained the eyes. Morning required restraint, just like night. You lie still, conserving warmth until movement makes sense. Rising too early exposes you to cold when insulation is working best. You will wait until light offers advantage. Your breathing remains slow. Sleep returns lightly, then recedes again. The boundary between rest and wake thins as morning approaches. This is natural. The body prepares gradually, not abruptly. You feel a faint stiffness in your joints, the kind that signals it will be time to move eventually. Not yet. This stiffness is information, not discomfort. It tells you the body is shifting states. There is scholarly debate about whether frontier people slept less deeply toward morning due to anticipation or because of environmental changes like temperature and light. Evidence suggests both played roles. The body responds to multiple cues simultaneously. You imagine standing later feeling the ground again through your feet. You do not imagine action in detail, just orientation. North-south, the slope of land. These mental notes come without effort. Morning requires orientation before movement. You notice how your thoughts feel slightly clearer now, less dreamlike. The night has done its work. Rest has accumulated. You are not fully restored, but you are sufficient. That word returns often out here. Enough. Snow creaks faintly as temperature shifts again. The sound is different from earlier, lighter, less compressed. This is another marker. Morning is working its way toward you through physics, not intention. You remain still, letting the transition complete itself. The night is not over yet. Ending it prematurely wastes what it still offers. Quiet, insulation, stability. The frontier taught patience in both directions. Waiting out storms, waiting in shelter, waiting for light. Action taken at the wrong moment often cost more than inaction. You allow your eyes to stay closed as brightness increases subtly. Vision will return when it is ready. For now, sensation guides you. There is a calm satisfaction in reaching this stage of the night. Not pride, just acknowledgement. You stayed, you managed. You did not rush or resist unnecessarily. That matters. As the horizon brightens beyond your shelter, you remain wrapped in stillness. Morning will ask things of you soon enough. For now, it simply announces itself gently without demand. You breathe in, feeling the air change again, and breathe out, releasing the last heavy weight of night. The transition is underway. You do not need to help it. Wrapped in patience and quiet readiness, you rest in the final stretch before dawn, letting the frontier morning approach at its own pace, confident that when it fully arrives, you will be ready to meet it without hurry. Snow has a way of erasing stories overnight. Paths you followed yesterday soften, blur, then vanish entirely. By morning, the land pretends nothing ever passed through it. You think about this as you lie still, sensing the weight of new snow, settling into old impressions, smoothing them away without effort or intention. Earlier, when you arrived here, the ground still showed signs of movement, a scuffed patch, a compressed line where something heavy passed. Those marks are gone now. Snow fills and levels, returning the surface to neutrality. The landscape resets itself nightly in winter, indifferent to human memory. Travel journals from winter crossings frequently note how quickly tracks disappeared after snowfall. People learned not to rely on yesterday's signs, especially during storms or steady accumulation. Navigation required landmarks that did not move because snow rewrote everything else. This reality shaped how routes were chosen and how mistakes multiplied. You feel a strange comfort in this erasure. There is no pressure to remember every step you took. The land does not hold you accountable. Mistakes vanish along with successes. Morning does not judge what happened overnight. It simply presents a clean surface. A curious detail appears in several winter letters describing travelers intentionally avoiding marking their campsites in snow before leaving, knowing any attempt at record keeping would be temporary. Snow would claim it anyway. This acceptance of impermanence altered how people thought about progress. What mattered was not trace but outcome. You imagine waking later and stepping out into a world that looks untouched. No visible evidence that you endured a long night here. This invisibility is humbling. It reminds you how small your presence is against weather and time. There has been extended scholarly discussion about how this constant erasure influenced frontier psychology. Some suggest it reduced attachment to place. Others argue it encouraged adaptability and resilience. When nothing stayed marked, people learned to move without clinging. You feel your own experiences of the night, already fading in detail. Sensations remain, lessons remain, but specific moments blur together. Snow does the same to memory, as it does to track smoothing edges, leaving behind general shape rather than sharp line. You think briefly about how modern life records everything automatically. Footprints are logged, paths saved. Out here, winter deletes history nightly. This deletion removes pressure to perform or document. Survival becomes the only metric. A lesser-known anecdote from a winter trapping account describes a man waking to find his own camp almost unrecognizable beneath fresh snow. He described feeling momentarily disoriented, then strangely relieved. The night had passed and nothing demanded explanation. You listen again. Snow settles softly. No crunch of movement, no disturbance. The world outside remains still and unmarked. This quiet blankness allows your mind to rest without replay. Snow erasure also brings risk. Without tracks returning becomes harder. Losing orientation becomes easier. Frontier travelers compensated by memorizing land contours rather than paths, slopes, tree lines, wind patterns. These remained even when snow covered everything else. Researchers continue to debate whether people became more spatially aware in winter landscapes because of this erasure. Some argue reliance on permanent features sharpened navigation skills. Others believe disorientation was more common than accounts admit. Either way, snow demanded a different way of reading land. You imagine stepping out later, testing the surface with a careful footfall. The first crunch would feel loud after the night's quiet. The sound would announce presence where none existed moments before. Even movement has weight here. You remain still for now, letting the snow complete its quiet work. Tracks erased, edges softened, evidence removed. The night closes behind you without ceremony. There is something freeing about leaving no trace. The night took care of itself. The morning will not carry yesterday's burdens visibly forward. You can begin again, without the land reminding you where you stumbled or stood firm. You breathe slowly, feeling the last of the night's tension drain away. Snow continues to fall lightly, finalizing its erasure. As awareness softens again, you accept this temporary anonymity. The frontier did not offer permanence, it offered continuity. Each day stood on its own, shaped by conditions rather than history. Wrapped in quiet and fresh accumulation, you rest in the knowledge that when you rise, the world will meet you without memory of the night you endured. Only you will carry that forward in habits, in muscle, in the calm that comes from surviving something that leaves no mark behind. By morning, stories begin to change. What felt ordinary during the night often reads as heroic later, once warmth returns and distance grows. You sense this shift even before standing up. The night you just lived through feels smaller, already less sharp at the edges. Memory edits quietly, trimming discomfort, highlighting competence. You understand now why so many frontier accounts feel oddly restrained, or oddly proud sometimes, both at once. Writers did not always exaggerate on purpose. Time did that for them. Once the cold released its grip, survival felt less like endurance and more like proof of character. A widely accepted observation, drawn from frontier memoirs, is that winter hardships were often downplayed in writing, especially when addressed to family or sponsors. Suffering was softened, routine was emphasized, endurance became normal. This was not deception so much as perspective shifting once danger passed. You think about how modern readers sometimes misunderstand this tone. They imagine bravado where there was simply relief, or indifference where there was careful discipline. Reading these accounts without feeling the cold leads to misinterpretation. Night teaches things that daylight forgets. You lie still a moment longer, aware that once you rise, the night becomes narrative instead of condition. Already parts of it feel less immediate. The fear that dulled earlier feels distant. The stillness feels intentional rather than imposed. Memory reshapes experience quickly. There is a small but telling detail, found in several winter journals, where writers apologized for the dullness of their descriptions, insisting nothing of note happened. Modern readers often disagree, finding those same passages gripping. What feels routine to the survivor feels remarkable to the observer. You recognize that divide now. From inside the night, nothing demanded commentary. Systems worked, choices held. From outside, the same night might look extreme. Both views are true. Scholars still debate how much frontier narratives were shaped by later cultural expectations of toughness. Some argue writers consciously minimized difficulty to align with ideals of resilience. Others suggest the editing happened subconsciously, as memory prioritized function over feeling. Lying here, it feels like forgetting was a kindness rather than a strategy. You notice how your body prepares to move even before you decide to. Muscles tighten slightly. Joints signal readiness. The night is ending as an experience and becoming background. This transition happens fast. The body wastes little time on reflection. A curious anecdote from a fur trade letter describes a man rereading his own winter journal years later and barely recognizing the events described. He remembered the routes, not the nights, the outcomes, not the sensations. The cold had been forgotten, but the habits remained. You consider how that forgetting shapes history. What gets written down is often incomplete, not because people lied, but because they no longer felt the same urgency. The night that demanded total attention becomes just one entry among many. There is ongoing academic discussion about whether frontier accounts systematically underreported psychological strain. Some researchers point to gaps where emotion might have been present but unrecorded. Others argue emotional expression was embedded in practical detail rather than explicit confession. Both interpretations find support. You feel calm now, but you remember how that calm was earned slowly, hour by hour. Soon even that memory will blur. What remains will be the knowledge that you can do this again if needed. That knowledge is quieter than fear, but more durable. You imagine telling someone about the night later. You would probably mention the snow, the wind, the stillness. You might leave out the constant calculations, the listening, the restraint. Not because they were unimportant, but because they are difficult to translate. The frontier night resists summary. It does not resolve into a single lesson. It leaves impressions rather than conclusions. That is why modern readers often search these accounts for drama that was never the point. You think about how survival here was not about overcoming nature, but about aligning with it. That alignment does not make for thrilling stories. It makes for continuity. Many did not survive because they sought triumph instead of fit. Researchers continue to examine how this mismatch between lived experience and recorded narrative shaped popular images of frontier life. Some suggest later romantic portrayals filled gaps left by understated originals. Others argue restraint itself was a cultural marker of competence. You shift slightly, feeling the bedroll release its grip as warmth increases. Movement feels easier now. The night's authority weakens. Soon it will be gone entirely. There is a quiet irony in this. The night demanded everything while it lasted, then asked nothing once it ended. It leaves no mark on the land and only a softened trace in memory. You recognize that this is why frontier nights could repeat without crushing morale. Forgetting was part of survival. You remembered what mattered and let the rest dissolve. As light strengthens outside, the night recedes further into story. What remains is a sense of capability. You stayed, you adapted, you did not rush or panic. That is enough. You breathe in, preparing to rise soon. The day will bring its own demands, its own calculations. The night will not accompany you except as quiet confidence stored somewhere below conscious thought. The frontier did not reward those who clung to past hardship. It rewarded those who moved forward, carrying only what was useful. The rest was left behind erased like tracks in snow. You let that erasure happen without resistance. The night fades into background, becoming one of many endured rather than something singular. Wrapped in this gentle forgetting, you rest for a final moment before standing, understanding now why so many winter nights survive only faintly in history. They did their work, then stepped aside, allowing life to continue without insisting on remembrance. By the time the night loosens its grip, you understand something that never made headlines or paintings. Survival out here was not dramatic. It was quiet competence repeated until it looked ordinary. The frontier did not reward bold gestures. It rewarded the ability to keep doing small correct things without needing acknowledgement. You feel this understanding settle as the light strengthens just enough to separate shadow from shape. Nothing spectacular happened overnight, and yet everything important did. You stayed warm, you stayed aware, you did not waste energy. That was the work. Many period accounts written by traders, scouts, and winter travelers reflect this understated tone. Nights are often summarized in a line or two. Slept well, weather cold, no incidents. Modern readers sometimes miss how much knowledge sits behind those words. Entire systems of behavior are compressed into a sentence. You recognize now that competence out here was not loud. It did not announce itself. It looked like restraint. It sounded like silence managed correctly. It felt like knowing when to act and when to remain still. There is a telling detail found in several winter ledgers where experienced men noted the absence of mistakes rather than the presence of success. Boots stayed dry, fire lasted, shelter held. These negative spaces were achievements. Nothing going wrong was the goal. You shift slightly, testing stiffness in your joints. It responds predictably. This too is competence, knowing what your body will do before it does it. You are not surprised by yourself. That lack of surprise matters. Scholars continue to examine why frontier narratives emphasize endurance over heroism. Some argue that communities valued reliability more than spectacle. Others suggest that constant exposure to risk-normalized hardship to the point where only failure felt noteworthy. Both interpretations likely apply. You think about how different this is from modern survival stories that highlight extremes. The frontier night did not care about extremes, it cared about averages. Could you keep your heat loss manageable? Could you keep your mind steady? Could you repeat this again tomorrow if needed? A curious anecdote from a winter supply post journal describes a man being praised not for a daring rescue, but for arriving on time with dry feet. That was considered exceptional. The bar for success was not glory, it was consistency. You feel the truth of that now. The night you just passed does not feel like an accomplishment in the way modern culture defines one. It feels like continuity. You are here, you can move, you can proceed. That is the outcome. The cold still exists, but it no longer presses as hard. Light changes the rules slightly, visibility returns, options expand. The night's strict economy relaxes. Soon you will stand and transition into a different set of calculations. There remains active academic discussion about whether frontier competence was learned primarily through hardship or through observation of experienced individuals. Evidence suggests both were necessary. Hardship taught urgency, observation taught efficiency. Nights like this reinforced both. You imagine someone watching you from a distance, seeing nothing remarkable. A figure rising from a bedroll, a small camp, snow settling. They would not know how many choices made that moment possible. Competence rarely looks impressive from the outside. You feel no urge to dramatize the night in your own mind. It does not need framing. It simply fits into a sequence of nights, each reinforcing the same lessons. Repetition builds skill more reliably than crisis. The frontier valued people who could be counted on, who did not panic when conditions worsened, who did not overreact when things went quiet. Reliability became a form of trust that mattered more than charisma. You take one deeper breath, preparing to move soon. The air feels different now, lighter, more forgiving. Morning is close enough to matter. This is the moment when many people later writing would insert meaning, would frame the night as trial or triumph. You let that impulse pass. Meaning is less important than readiness. You have learned what you needed to learn tonight. Not as a lesson you could summarize, but as a capability you now carry. You can do this again. That knowledge is quiet but powerful. As the last heaviness of night recedes, you remain grounded in the simplicity of what worked. Shelter, stillness, awareness, fuel, habit. None of it glamorous, all of it effective. The frontier night recedes without ceremony, leaving behind no monument, no marker. Just you still able to stand still, able to move forward. And that out here was the highest measure of success. The night loosens its grip gradually, not all at once. Darkness thins rather than breaks, retreating in soft increments that feel almost polite after the long hours of insistence. You notice it first as space. The world feels wider, air moves differently. Even before you open your eyes, you sense that the rules have shifted. You lie still for a moment longer, letting that change complete itself. Rising too quickly would waste the night's final gift, the warmth carefully held by stillness. You have learned that lesson well. The frontier rewards patience, even at the threshold of morning. Winter travel accounts often describe this moment without emphasis, as if it were unremarkable. Writers noted waking, packing, moving on. Yet this transition from night to day carried enormous significance. The most dangerous hours had passed, systems had held, the body had endured. Dawn confirmed survival without celebrating it. You open your eyes slightly. Light is diffuse, filtered through cloud and snow. There are no sharp shadows yet, only gentle contrast. Shapes separate themselves from one another. The shelter looks smaller now, less absolute. Night magnifies everything. Day returns proportion. You begin to move carefully. Fingers flex, toes test sensation. Joints answer slowly but predictably. No surprises. This predictability is success. You do not rush to stand. You let circulation wake fully before asking more of your body. A small but telling detail appears in several winter diaries, describing people delaying their first full movement of the day until they had mentally oriented themselves. They took a moment to remember direction, slope, wind. Morning mistakes could undo a night's careful work. You follow that instinct now. You recall where the land falls away, where trees cluster, where wind came from during the night. Orientation precedes action. This order matters. There has long been discussion among historians about whether frontier mornings felt hopeful or simply procedural. Some argue dawn lifted spirits. Others suggest emotional response was muted, replaced by practical focus. Lying here, it feels less like relief and more like continuity. Night ends, day begins, the work continues. You sit up slowly, feeling cold reassert itself where insulation thins. That is expected. Movement trades warmth for mobility. You accept the exchange consciously rather than being startled by it. The fire is mostly embers now, ash settled thickly over glowing red. It did its job. You acknowledge it without ceremony. The animals stir, stretching, shaking off snow. Their movements feel unhurried. That calm carries weight. Snow around the camp looks untouched. Tracks erased, shelter edges softened. Nothing marks the long hours you spent here. The land has already forgotten the night. Only you carry it forward. You stand at last steady on your feet. The cold feels sharper now, but manageable. You are awake enough to work with it. Clothing stiffens slightly, then loosens, as heat moves again. Everything behaves as expected. This is where many later stories would end with movement and progress. But before that, there is a quieter moment, one you rarely see recorded. Standing in morning light, aware that nothing dramatic happened, and yet everything mattered. You feel no need to narrate the night to yourself. It does not require interpretation. It has already shaped you in small ways that will surface later when needed. As the day waits to be entered fully, you allow yourself one last pause, breathing in the cold air, steady and calm, feeling the weight of night. Lift without resistance. The pace slows now. There is no urgency. The world feels gentler in daylight, even when it remains cold. You let your movements stay deliberate, unhurried. The night is over, but its lessons linger softly, like warmth held in fabric, long after fire fades. Your breathing lengthens, muscles ease, the sharp edges of awareness soften. You do not need to think about what comes next. The morning will handle that. You feel safe enough to let your thoughts drift without direction. The frontier night has passed, and with it the need for constant calculation. Now there is space for rest, even standing, even awake. If you're listening from far away, tucked into your own bed, you let this sense of quiet competence settle into you as well. Nothing is required right now. The night has been endured. The body knows how to rest. Your thoughts slow. The imagery fades. Cold becomes abstract again, no longer pressing against skin. The world grows softer, less demanding. You breathe in, you breathe out, each breath a little slower than the last. The frontier night recedes fully now, not with a bang, but with a whisper, leaving behind calm steadiness and the deep reassurance that comes from knowing you can remain still when stillness is the strongest choice. Sleep drifts back in gentle and unforced, sweet dreams.